button and leave a like. It really helps. Thank you for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Wade Morrison's Burgundy Kenworth T680 rolled eastbound through the Nevada desert on Interstate 80, its diesel engine maintaining the steady rhythm that had carried him across America's highways for 23 years. The digital clock on his dashboard read 2:17 a.m. as he passed through one of the most desolate stretches of highway in the continental United States, where the nearest town was 50 miles in any direction, and cell towers were as scarce as water in the high desert. At 44, Wade knew every mile marker, truck stop, and CB radio dead zone between Sacramento and Salt Lake City. The burgundy and chrome rig had been his mobile office and second home since his divorce 8 years earlier, hauling everything from electronics to furniture across the western states. His current load was restaurant equipment bound for a customer in Denver, routine freight that would pay the bills and keep his teenage daughter Emma in the private school that his ex-wife insisted was necessary for her future. Wade preferred these midnight runs through Nevada's empty highways. The solitude gave him time to think without the constant pressure of four-wheelers cutting him off or state troopers looking for easy revenue from commercial drivers. The cooler temperatures were easier on his engine, and the night differential pay helped support the child support payments that consumed most of his monthly income. After 2 decades behind the wheel, Wade had developed the methodical routines that kept professional drivers safe and profitable. Regular radio checks, consistent schedules, and the unwritten code of helping other truckers when trouble struck on America's highways. What Wade couldn't know was that his predictable patterns and helpful nature had made him a target for people who understood the trucking industry well enough to exploit its culture of mutual assistance and professional courtesy. The trouble started with what seemed like a routine CB transmission on Channel 19, the frequency that connected truck drivers across the country in an informal network of road information, weather updates, and companionship that helped break the monotony of long-distance hauling. "Eastbound Kenworth at the 2:37 marker. You got your ears on, driver?" Wade glanced at his odometer and saw mile marker 235 approaching, making him the likely target of the call. He reached for his microphone, following the protocol that had connected truckers for decades, and created a brotherhood of professional drivers who looked out for each other on America's highways. "This is the eastbound Kenworth with the burgundy paint job. I got you, driver. Go ahead." "Appreciate the comeback, driver. Name's Billy, running a white Peterbilt about 2 miles behind you. Got some nasty weather moving in from the north according to my weather radio. Might want to keep an eye on that barometric pressure. Could get dicey around Winnemucca." Wade checked his instrument panel and looked through his windshield at the star-filled sky. The night was perfectly clear, with visibility extending to the horizon in every direction. His truck's onboard weather monitoring system showed stable high-pressure conditions for the next 6 hours, with no indication of approaching storm systems. "Copy that, Billy. Appreciate the heads up, but it looks pretty clear from where I sit. Might be getting different information than what I'm seeing. Sometimes these desert storms come up fast, driver. Been running these routes for 15 years, and I've learned to trust the weather service over what my eyes tell me. That system's supposed to hit around 300 hours with some serious wind and possible ice." Wade had been driving the Nevada highways for over a decade, and he'd never seen weather systems develop as quickly as Billy was describing. Desert storms were certainly unpredictable, but the current atmospheric conditions showed no sign of the instability that would generate the severe weather Billy was forecasting. "Well, I appreciate the warning. I'll keep monitoring the situation and adjust if I need to." "You do that, driver. Safety first out here in the big empty. Catch you on the flip side." The transmission ended, but Wade felt a nagging uneasiness that he couldn't quite identify. In 23 years of trucking, he'd learned to trust other drivers' observations about weather and road conditions. The trucker network was often more accurate than official weather services because drivers were actually experiencing conditions on the ground rather than interpreting satellite data from remote locations. But something about Billy's report didn't feel right. The specificity of the timing, the reference to weather service information that contradicted visible conditions, and the emphasis on his 15 years of experience all struck Wade as slightly off from normal trucker communication patterns. 20 minutes later, as Wade approached the Winnemucca area where Billy had predicted severe weather, his CB radio crackled with another transmission from a different voice. "Any drivers monitoring Channel 19, we got word of a major accident eastbound near the Winnemucca exit. Multiple vehicles involved, possible fatalities. Highway Patrol is shutting down eastbound traffic for at least 2 hours. Might want to find an alternate route." Wade knew the highways in this area better than most drivers who regularly traveled the California to Utah corridor. There were no practical alternate routes between his current position and Winnemucca that could accommodate commercial traffic. Any experienced trucker familiar with Nevada highways would know that detouring around I-80 in this region would add hundreds of miles to the journey and require traveling on secondary roads that weren't designed for 80,000-pound commercial vehicles. "Break 19. This is that eastbound Kenworth," Wade responded. "Can you give me more details on that accident? I'm not seeing any emergency vehicle traffic or road closure signs." There was a pause before the response came. "Just got the information from a westbound driver who was diverted at the scene. Looked pretty serious. You might want to start looking for a place to wait it out." Wade switched to Channel 17, a frequency used by many owner-operators for conversations away from the busier Channel 19. As he adjusted his radio, hoping to get confirmation of the reported accident from other drivers, he accidentally intercepted part of a conversation on Channel 18. "Package is moving according to schedule. Estimated intercept at 0300 hours. Driver appears unaware of surveillance." Wade froze at his radio controls. The clinical, professional tone was completely unlike anything he'd heard on trucker frequencies in over 2 decades of monitoring CB communications. This wasn't the casual conversation style of drivers sharing road information or passing time during long hauls. The language suggested military or law enforcement communications, but legitimate agencies used encrypted digital systems, not open CB frequencies that anyone with a radio could monitor. Wade fine-tuned his receiver and caught more of the transmission. "Target maintains consistent speed and route. Vehicle identification confirmed. Recommend implementing Phase 2 at mile marker 254. Wade's Army Reserve training from his younger days triggered immediate alert. Someone was conducting active surveillance of highway traffic and coordinating operations using terms that suggested planned interception of specific vehicles. The target they were discussing could be any driver on this stretch of highway, but the reference to consistent speed and route made Wade wonder if he was the subject of their surveillance. Wade tried to switch back to Channel 19 to warn other drivers about the suspicious communications, but the frequency was now carrying only distant chatter from truckers hundreds of miles away. The local voices that had been providing information about weather and accidents had vanished from the airwaves, leaving only the routine long-distance traffic that characterized late-night CB activity. Wade's truck was approaching mile marker 250, uncomfortably close to the mile marker 254 mentioned in the surveillance transmission. His military experience told him that he needed to test whether he was being monitored by making an unscheduled deviation from his normal route pattern. Wade activated his turn signal and took exit 252, heading toward a small truck stop that served local ranchers and the occasional passing commercial vehicle. The facility wasn't on his regular route, and stopping there would break the predictable pattern that someone might be using to track his movements. As Wade slowed for the exit ramp, his CB radio crackled with an urgent transmission that confirmed his worst fears. "Eastbound Kenworth taking the 252 exit. You need to get back on the highway, driver. Road's washed out about 3 miles ahead. Bridge inspection crew has it blocked until morning." Wade had used this exit dozens of times over the years to visit a customer in the small town beyond the truck stop. The road was in good condition with a recently rebuilt bridge that showed no signs of structural problems. Someone was trying to control his movements using false information about road conditions. Wade ignored the warning and continued toward the truck stop, watching his mirrors carefully for any vehicles that might be following him. The parking lot was nearly empty except for a single pickup truck, a motorcycle, and one other big rig that appeared to be shut down for the night. Normal activity for a small facility at 2:30 in the morning. Wade parked his truck in a spot that gave him clear sight lines to all approach routes and walked into the truck stop, a combination fuel station and diner that had been serving highway traffic since the 1960s. Behind the counter, an elderly man with weathered hands was reading a trucking magazine and looked up as Wade entered. "Evening, driver. Don't usually see big rigs stopping here this time of night. Most of you fellas just blow past on the interstate." "Just wanted to check my route and grab some coffee," Wade replied, studying the maps and road information posted on bulletin boards throughout the small facility. Wade used the truck stop's landline telephone to call his dispatcher in Sacramento, reporting his position and estimated arrival time in Denver. The call served multiple purposes. It documented his location for company records, provided an opportunity to report any unusual situations, and created a safety check that would trigger investigation if Wade failed to make his scheduled delivery. "Wade, everything all right out there?" his dispatcher asked. "You're not scheduled to stop until Elko, and this call is coming from a number I don't recognize." "Just being cautious about some weather reports I'm hearing on the CB," Wade replied carefully. He didn't want to sound paranoid or unstable, but he also wanted to document his concerns with someone who could alert authorities if he failed to check in at his next scheduled stop. "Wanted to verify road conditions before continuing. Weather Service shows clear conditions all the way to Utah. Haven't heard any reports of problems on your route." Wade thanked his dispatcher and ended the call, but his uneasiness was increasing rather than diminishing. The official weather information contradicted the CB reports. The road closure warning had been false, and the surveillance communications suggested that someone was tracking his movements with professional-level coordination. As Wade prepared to leave the truck stop and return to the interstate, he noticed a vehicle approaching the parking lot with its headlights turned off. The pickup truck that had been parked near the building when he arrived was now gone, and a different vehicle was taking its place near the fuel islands. Wade's military instincts told him that he was being watched by people who were rotating their surveillance to avoid detection. The coordination and timing suggested training and surveillance techniques that went far beyond ordinary criminal activity. Wade returned to his truck and resumed his eastbound journey on Interstate 80, but he was now operating under the assumption that he was being actively tracked by people with sophisticated equipment and professional training. His CB radio remained quiet, except for distant transmissions from drivers in other regions, creating an ominous silence where local highway communications should have been active. At mile marker 260, Wade's radio came alive with a transmission that eliminated any doubt about his situation. "Wade Morrison, driver of the burgundy Kenworth T680 with California plates, hauling restaurant equipment to Denver. You've been monitoring communications you weren't meant to hear." Wade had never given his name, truck description, or cargo details over the radio during the night's transmissions. The speakers had access to his personal identity, vehicle information, and shipping documentation through sources that should have been confidential and secure. Wade reached for his CB microphone to call for help from other truckers, but before he could key the transmitter, his radio erupted with static that blocked all communications on every channel. Someone was jamming the CB frequencies using sophisticated electronic equipment that could override normal radio traffic across the entire spectrum. Wade tried his cell phone, but the display showed no signal bars and no available networks. Electronic jamming was preventing both CB radio and cellular communications, effectively isolating Wade from any potential assistance from other drivers or emergency services. Wade's truck was now approaching the Humboldt River Valley, where Interstate 80 descended through a series of curves and hills that limited visibility and reduced escape options. If someone was planning to intercept his truck, this would be an ideal location for an attack because the terrain channeled traffic into predictable routes with few alternatives. Wade made a tactical decision based on his military training and knowledge of the local highway network. Instead of continuing on his planned route where his movements were predictable, he took the next available exit and headed north on Highway 225, a secondary road that connected to alternate routes toward his destination. The maneuver caught his pursuers off guard temporarily. Wade gained several miles on anyone who might be following him while forcing them to reorganize their surveillance pattern. But Wade also realized that he was now on lightly traveled roads where help would be even more difficult to find if the situation escalated to direct confrontation. Over the next hour, Wade found himself playing an elaborate game of cat and mouse with vehicles that appeared in his mirrors only to disappear when he tested their presence by varying his speed or changing routes. The pursuit was subtle and professional, suggesting people with extensive training in surveillance techniques and vehicle coordination. Wade's CB radio occasionally picked up fragments of communications despite the ongoing jamming, revealing that multiple vehicles were involved in tracking his movements across an extensive area of Nevada and Utah. Target has deviated from primary route, adjusting intercept positions to Highway 225 corridor. Maintain visual contact, but avoid detection until containment phase. Wade realized he was dealing with an organized group that had resources and coordination capabilities far beyond ordinary highway criminals. The professional communications, sophisticated jamming equipment, and multi-vehicle surveillance suggested connections to law enforcement or intelligence organizations, but legitimate agencies wouldn't be jamming communications and pursuing innocent commercial drivers. As Wade drove through the pre-dawn darkness on increasingly remote highways, he began to understand that he had stumbled into something involving the systematic targeting of commercial drivers for purposes he couldn't yet comprehend. The intercepted radio traffic had mentioned packages, delivery schedules, and coordination between multiple parties, suggesting a large-scale operation that used trucking routes and driver knowledge for illegal transportation activities. Wade's truck was now running low on fuel, forcing him to find a station despite the ongoing pursuit. He spotted a small facility at a crossroads community and decided to risk a fuel stop, knowing that his truck would be vulnerable during the 15 minutes required to fill his 300-gallon fuel tanks. As Wade began fueling his truck at the isolated station, he noticed several vehicles positioning themselves at strategic locations around the facility. The pursuit team was preparing to make their move, probably planning to capture Wade while his truck was stationary and unable to escape. Wade made a decision that violated every safety protocol he'd learned in 2 decades of professional trucking. He disconnected the fuel nozzle before his tanks were completely full and prepared to run, choosing mobility over fuel capacity in the hope of reaching populated areas where the pursuit team would have difficulty operating without attracting attention. But as Wade climbed back into his cab and started his engine, he realized that escape might no longer be possible. The vehicles surrounding the station had moved closer to blocking positions, and his CB radio was carrying transmissions that suggested the operation was entering its final phase. Target is preparing to depart fuel station. All units move to containment positions. This ends here. Wade understood that he was about to face a confrontation that would determine whether he survived to warn other drivers about the predators who were hunting professional truckers on America's highways. Wade Morrison's Kenworth pulled out of the isolated fuel station with his diesel tanks only 3/4 full, but with enough fuel to reach populated areas where the pursuit team would have difficulty operating without attracting unwanted attention. Behind him, Wade could see at least 4 vehicles beginning to move in the coordinated patterns he'd observed throughout the night, but now their positioning was more aggressive, suggesting the surveillance phase was ending and the capture phase was beginning. Wade's 23 years of professional driving had taught him that survival on the highway often depended on understanding traffic patterns and using other vehicles as shields against aggressive drivers or dangerous road conditions. He began working his way back toward Interstate 80 eastbound, where late-night commercial traffic would provide cover and potential witnesses to whatever his pursuers were planning. Wade's CB radio crackled with frustrated communications from the pursuit team as they tried to maintain surveillance while adapting to his unexpected fuel stop and route changes. Target is approaching I-80 eastbound on-ramp at milepost 268. Multiple commercial vehicles in immediate area. Recommend aborting direct intercept attempt until traffic thins. Negative on abort. Target has compromising intelligence on network operations. Containment is absolute priority regardless of visibility factors. Wade merged onto Interstate 80 and immediately positioned his truck between two other eastbound commercial vehicles. A grain hauler from Nebraska and a flatbed carrying construction equipment toward Colorado. The convoy formation made it difficult for pursuit vehicles to approach Wade's truck without obvious aggressive maneuvering that would be noticed by other professional drivers. Wade tried to contact the other truckers using his CB radio, but the communications jamming was still preventing normal transmissions on most channels. He could hear fragments of conversations from distant drivers operating hundreds of miles away, but local communications remained blocked by electronic countermeasures. Wade decided to use an old technique from his Army Reserve days for communicating under hostile conditions. He began flashing his headlights in specific patterns. 3 quick flashes, followed by 2 long ones, then 3 quick flashes again. The sequence was Morse code for SOS, a distress signal that any driver with military background might recognize. The grain hauler ahead of Wade responded immediately by flashing his marker lights in the same pattern, indicating that he understood something was wrong. The flatbed driver behind Wade also began flashing his lights, creating a chain of communication that bypassed the electronic jamming. The eastbound convoy continued for 20 miles, with pursuit vehicles maintaining their distance, but clearly coordinating their movements through radio communications that Wade could occasionally intercept despite the jamming efforts. Control, we have multiple commercial vehicles providing inadvertent screening for target. Recommend implementing distraction protocol to isolate target vehicle. Roger. Initiating false emergency scenario to split convoy formation. Wade's CB radio suddenly came back to life as the jamming ceased on channel 19, apparently to allow the pursuit team to implement their distraction protocol. Break 19. We got a serious accident westbound I-80 near mile marker 290. Overturned fuel tanker. Multiple casualties. Eastbound traffic being diverted to provide emergency vehicle access. All eastbound trucks need to exit at 285 and use alternate routes. The grain hauler ahead of Wade immediately began slowing and activating his turn signal to take the suggested exit. Wade realized that the false emergency report was designed to break up the protective convoy formation and isolate him for capture. Wade made a split-second decision that probably saved his life. Instead of following the other trucks off the highway, he accelerated past them and continued eastbound on I-80, using his CB radio to broadcast a warning that he hoped would reach other drivers despite the electronic countermeasures. Break 19, this is Wade Morrison driving eastbound Kenworth being pursued by unknown vehicles on I-80 near mile marker 285. I've been followed for over 3 hours by people using professional surveillance tactics and electronic jamming. The accident report is false. Any drivers in the area, please be aware of coordinated suspicious activity. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Dozens of truckers began reporting their positions and offering assistance, creating an informal network of protection that made it impossible for the pursuit team to operate covertly. Eastbound Wade. This is Roy in a westbound Peterbilt at mile marker 295. I can see several vehicles that appear to be coordinating their movements behind you. Looks like you got yourself a serious problem, driver. Wade, this is Curtis running grain hauler eastbound ahead of you. I just got off at that exit they told us about, and there's no accident anywhere. These boys are running some kind of scam. I'm getting back on the interstate to help you out. Break 19, this is Dale in a flatbed about 10 miles behind Wade's position. I'm monitoring multiple vehicle movements that don't look like normal highway traffic. Somebody's definitely tracking our boy. Within minutes, Wade found himself surrounded by a protective convoy of commercial vehicles whose drivers had responded to his emergency call. The trucking community's informal mutual aid network was mobilizing to protect one of their own from people who were exploiting their isolation and vulnerability. Wade's CB radio carried continuous updates from drivers who were monitoring the situation and coordinating their response through the communication methods that had connected truckers for decades. We got at least 6 vehicles that have been following Wade's truck for over an hour. All dark colors, multiple occupants, definitely not normal highway traffic. I'm calling this in to Utah State Police on my cell phone. All drivers maintain convoy formation and document everything you observe. The pursuit vehicles began falling back as more truckers joined the protective convoy, but Wade could see that they were maintaining surveillance from a greater distance rather than abandoning their operation entirely. "Wade, this is Rex running a Peterbilt westbound," came a transmission from behind the convoy. "I got eyes on 2 of those suspicious vehicles that dropped back when we formed up. They're using some kind of professional radio equipment, big antennas, sophisticated gear. These ain't ordinary highway troublemakers." By sunrise, Wade was traveling in a convoy of nearly 20 commercial vehicles, all coordinated through CB radio communications and all committed to ensuring his safety until he could reach populated areas where law enforcement could provide protection. At the Utah border, Utah State Police intercepted the convoy and took Wade's statement about the pursuit and the suspicious radio communications he had intercepted. Sergeant Mike Collins, a veteran officer who specialized in highway crime, was particularly interested in the electronic jamming and professional surveillance techniques Wade described. "Mr. Morrison, what you're describing sounds like a sophisticated criminal operation with resources that go way beyond ordinary highway crime. The coordination, electronic equipment, and multi-vehicle surveillance suggest an organization with significant funding and professional training." Wade worked with Sergeant Collins to analyze the radio communications he had recorded on his truck's digital CB system and the observations he had made during the pursuit. The intercepts revealed references to packages, delivery schedules, and processing centers that suggested a large-scale operation involving multiple trucks and drivers. "Wade, what you heard wasn't just about hijacking individual trucks," Sergeant Collins explained. "These people were talking about processing drivers, which suggests something more systematic than ordinary cargo theft. They're recruiting or capturing truckers for ongoing criminal operations." Over the next several days, Wade learned that he had encountered something far worse than highway robbery. The investigation revealed that several drivers had disappeared from the same highways where Wade had been pursued, leaving only abandoned trucks and no trace of what had happened to their operators. Marcus Webb, a driver from Phoenix, had vanished near Elko 3 months earlier. Dean Fletcher from Salt Lake City had disappeared on the same stretch of I-80 where Wade had been pursued. Roy Kimball from Denver had been reported missing after his truck was found abandoned at a rest area with no sign of the driver. "We're looking at a pattern of activity targeting commercial drivers throughout the western states," Sergeant Collins explained. "These people understand trucking operations well enough to predict driver behavior and exploit industry communication systems." The investigation expanded when other drivers began reporting similar experiences after Wade's story spread through the trucking community. Rex Sullivan, an owner-operator from Idaho, had been pursued by coordinated vehicles after intercepting similar radio communications. Jake Morrison from Oregon had encountered fake emergency calls that led him into situations where suspicious vehicles attempted to force him off the highway. "The pattern is consistent," Sergeant Collins told Wade during one of their follow-up meetings. "These people are using CB radio monitoring to identify targets, electronic jamming to isolate victims, and coordinated vehicle surveillance to capture commercial drivers for purposes we're still investigating." Wade learned that the radio equipment recovered from abandoned pursuit vehicles was sophisticated and expensive, the kind of gear used by intelligence agencies and military organizations rather than ordinary criminals. "This equipment costs more than most people make in a year," Sergeant Collins said, showing Wade photographs of the recovered surveillance gear. "We're not dealing with ordinary highway criminals. This is an organization with serious financial backing and technical capabilities." But the most disturbing discovery was that the criminal organization hadn't been eliminated by the investigation. Other drivers continued to report suspicious encounters, suggesting that Wade had exposed only one cell of a larger network that operated throughout the western United States. Wade began working with other drivers who had experienced similar encounters, developing informal communication protocols that allowed truckers to verify each other's identities and alert the community to suspicious activity. They created code words and check-in procedures that could help protect commercial drivers from predators who understood their industry. Rex Sullivan became Wade's primary contact in this informal security network, using his routes through Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming to coordinate communications with drivers throughout the region. "Wade, we're seeing patterns of activity that suggest these people are still operating," Rex reported during one of their regular CB conferences. "Drivers are reporting fake emergency calls, electronic jamming, and coordinated vehicle surveillance on multiple highways throughout the Mountain West." The CB radio frequencies that had once been used primarily for traffic information and casual conversation became the foundation for a security network that helped protect commercial drivers from systematic exploitation. Drivers shared information about suspicious activities, coordinated convoy formations through high-risk areas, and maintained continuous monitoring of frequencies where threats might be detected. Wade never learned the full scope of the organization that had pursued him, but his experience had revealed the vulnerability of commercial drivers to sophisticated criminal operations that understood trucking culture well enough to exploit it. The isolation that made trucking attractive to independent-minded drivers also made them perfect targets for people who needed transportation resources and disposable personnel for illegal activities. 3 months after Wade's encounter, coordinated law enforcement raids dismantled several cells of the criminal network and rescued drivers who had been held at remote facilities. But investigators acknowledged that other operations were probably still active in different regions, using similar methods to exploit America's commercial transportation system. Wade returned to his regular routes between California and Colorado. But his experience had fundamentally changed his approach to highway safety and professional relationships with other drivers. He now carried additional communication equipment, varied his schedules and routes, and maintained continuous contact with the informal security network that had developed among drivers who understood the ongoing threat. Most importantly, Wade had become part of a brotherhood that extended beyond casual CB radio friendships to encompass genuine mutual protection against predators who viewed commercial drivers as resources to be exploited rather than people deserving basic safety and respect on America's highways. 6 months after Wade Morrison's encounter with the Highway Surveillance Network, the informal security system that had developed among Western truckers had evolved into something approaching a secret brotherhood. Drivers throughout Nevada, Utah, Colorado, and surrounding states maintained continuous communication through encrypted CB radio protocols, shared intelligence about suspicious activities, and provided coordinated protection for truckers who found themselves targeted by criminal organizations that continued to operate along America's major freight corridors. Wade had become the unofficial coordinator of this network, using his military background and survival experience to help develop security procedures that kept commercial drivers alive on increasingly dangerous highways. The system worked through code names and communication procedures that allowed drivers to verify each other's identities without revealing personal information over radio frequencies that might be monitored by hostile parties. Wade operated under the call sign Desert Fox. Rex Sullivan from Idaho was Mountain Man. Curtis Miller, the grain hauler who had been among the first to respond to Wade's emergency call, was Harvest Moon, and Dale Patterson, a veteran driver from Colorado with military intelligence experience, was known as High Country. Their informal organization had prevented at least 15 attempted kidnappings of commercial drivers over the past 6 months, using convoy tactics, communication networks, and coordinated responses that made it nearly impossible for criminal organizations to isolate and capture individual truckers. But the criminals were adapting to the truckers' defensive measures, developing new tactics and more sophisticated equipment designed to overcome the protective networks. Wade was eastbound on Interstate 40 through Arizona, hauling automotive parts from Los Angeles to Dallas, when his enhanced CB radio system picked up transmissions that revealed the true scope of the threat facing commercial drivers throughout the American West. Control Center Alpha, this is Mobile Unit 7 operating from Nevada Sector. We've identified the primary coordination node for the Trucker Resistance Network. Wade Morrison, call sign Desert Fox, operates from Sacramento and coordinates protective activities across 6 states. Wade immediately activated his emergency alert system, broadcasting coded warnings to network members while recording the intercepted communications for analysis. Mobile Unit 7, Control Center Alpha confirms target identification. Morrison has cost the organization over $3 million in lost operations and recruitment failures. Priority directive is elimination with extreme prejudice. Wade switched to his network's secure communication channel and began coordinating an immediate response to the threat escalation. All network stations, this is Desert Fox with a priority alpha alert. Hostile forces have identified network leadership and are implementing elimination protocols. All drivers activate maximum security procedures immediately. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Over 200 drivers throughout the western states began implementing the security procedures that Wade's network had developed over months of operations against criminal organizations that targeted commercial truckers. Rex Sullivan responded first from his position in Montana. Desert Fox, this is Mountain Man. I copy your priority alpha alert. Montana Sector is implementing convoy protocols and coordinating with law enforcement liaisons. Dale Patterson transmitted from Colorado. High Country acknowledges priority alpha. Colorado and New Mexico sectors are activating protective formations and secure communication procedures. Curtis Miller coordinated the response from drivers operating throughout Utah and Wyoming. Harvest Moon confirms priority alpha reception. Western Slope drivers are forming protective convoys and establishing surveillance patterns. Wade's CB radio continued to carry intercepted transmissions from the criminal organization, revealing a coordinated operation involving dozens of vehicles and personnel positioned throughout multiple states. All mobile units, target is eastbound I-40 Arizona sector. Implement containment protocols and prepare for immediate extraction. This operation has presidential priority from organizational leadership. Wade realized that his resistance activities had escalated the conflict to the highest levels of the criminal organization. They were now prepared to use extraordinary resources to eliminate him and disrupt the protective network he had helped create. Wade's truck was approaching Flagstaff when his enhanced surveillance equipment detected the coordinated movement patterns that indicated professional pursuit. Multiple vehicles were positioning themselves to monitor his route while maintaining communications that suggested military-level coordination and equipment. All units, target is approaching designated intercept zone. Implement Phase 2 containment protocols. Electronic warfare systems are authorized for full deployment. Within minutes, Wade's communication systems began experiencing sophisticated jamming that blocked CB radio, cellular, and satellite communications across a wide area of northern Arizona. The criminal organization was using military-grade electronic warfare equipment to isolate him from his protective network. But Wade's network had anticipated this possibility and developed countermeasures that didn't depend on electronic communications. As Wade's radio systems failed, he began implementing the visual signaling protocols that his network had learned from military communications procedures. Wade began flashing his headlights in specific patterns. Long, short, long, short, long, the Morse code sequence for the letter W, indicating Wade was in distress. He followed this with 3 quick flashes, 2 long flashes, and 3 quick flashes, the universal SOS distress signal. Other drivers on Interstate 40 began responding to Wade's visual signals, flashing their own lights to indicate they understood his situation and were coordinating a response. The trucker network's visual communication system allowed them to organize protective measures even when electronic systems were being jammed. Within 20 minutes, Wade found himself surrounded by a convoy of commercial vehicles whose drivers had recognized his distress signals and abandoned their planned routes to provide assistance. The criminal pursuit team found their operation compromised by dozens of witnesses who were documenting their activities and coordinating countermeasures. Troy Mansfield, an experienced driver Wade had helped train in convoy tactics, used his truck's PA system to broadcast information about the pursuit to other drivers in the area. All drivers on I-40 eastbound, we have a coordinated criminal operation targeting one of our brothers. Multiple suspicious vehicles are attempting to isolate and capture a commercial driver. All truckers in the area are requested to provide protective convoy services. The response exceeded anything Wade had seen during previous network operations. Over 40 commercial vehicles joined the protective convoy, creating a rolling fortress that made any attack impossible while simultaneously generating enough radio traffic on multiple frequencies to overwhelm the criminal organization's jamming equipment. Jake Morrison, a driver from Portland who had experienced his own encounter with highway predators, coordinated the convoy's defensive formation using hand signals and visual communications. "Desert Fox, this is Portland Jake. We've got you covered from all directions. These boys picked the wrong trucker to mess with today." The criminal pursuit vehicles gradually fell back and disappeared as the protective convoy continued eastbound through Arizona and into New Mexico. The truckers' coordinated response had demonstrated that their network possessed capabilities that matched or exceeded those of the criminal organizations that targeted commercial drivers. But Wade understood that his survival had come at a cost to the entire trucking community. The criminals now knew the extent of the protective network and would develop new tactics designed to overcome the truckers' defensive capabilities. Wade's CB radio came back to life as the electronic jamming ceased, apparently because the pursuit team had recognized that their operation had failed. "Desert Fox, this is Mountain Man transmitting from Montana sector. We monitored electronic interference throughout the southwestern region and coordinated response protocols. Network effectiveness exceeded all previous operations. Dale Patterson provided intelligence analysis of the criminal organization's capabilities. High country reporting from Colorado. The electronic warfare equipment used against Desert Fox was military specification gear that costs more than most trucking companies earn in a year. We're dealing with an organization that has resources comparable to intelligence agencies." Curtis Miller coordinated debriefing procedures that would allow the network to learn from the encounter and develop improved defensive measures. Harvest Moon coordinating network analysis. We need to document everything observed during this operation and distribute intelligence to all network members. Over the next week, Wade worked with his network leadership to analyze the criminal organization's tactics and develop countermeasures that would protect other drivers who might be targeted for elimination. The investigation revealed that the organization possessed capabilities that suggested connections to government agencies or military contractors. The equipment signatures we detected indicate access to restricted military technology, Dale Patterson reported during a secure network conference. Electronic warfare systems, encrypted communications, coordinated surveillance capabilities. This isn't equipment that criminal organizations can purchase through normal channels. Rex Sullivan added intelligence from his contacts in law enforcement agencies throughout Montana and Idaho. Mountain Man has confirmed that several federal agencies are investigating the disappearance of commercial drivers throughout the western states. The scope of the criminal organization appears to extend far beyond what we initially understood. Wade realized that his network had uncovered something that threatened powerful interests beyond ordinary criminal enterprises. The systematic targeting of truck drivers, The sophisticated equipment and coordination, and the resources devoted to eliminating resistance, suggested an organization with connections that extended into legitimate institutions. Curtis Miller provided the most disturbing intelligence of all. Harvest Moon has been monitoring CB communications throughout Utah and Wyoming. We're detecting coordination between criminal pursuit teams and individuals who appear to have access to law enforcement databases and communication systems. Wade understood that his network was facing enemies who had infiltrated the institutions that should have been protecting commercial drivers from systematic exploitation. The criminals possessed inside information about driver routes, cargo manifests, and law enforcement operations that allowed them to target victims with precision while avoiding detection. The network's success in protecting Wade had revealed the extent of their capabilities, but it had also made them a priority target for elimination by an organization that possessed resources and connections that rivaled those of government agencies. Wade made a decision that would fundamentally change the nature of their security network. Instead of simply protecting drivers from criminal predators, they would begin actively investigating the organization that was targeting truckers and work to expose the connections that allowed criminals to operate with apparent immunity from law enforcement intervention. All network leadership. This is Desert Fox with a strategic assessment. Our protective operations have been successful, but we're facing enemies with resources that suggest institutional connections. We need to shift from defensive to investigative operations if we're going to eliminate the threat permanently. The decision would transform Wade's informal security network into an intelligence organization that used the trucking community's mobility and communications capabilities to gather evidence about criminal activities that legitimate institutions had failed to detect or address. 3 months after the Arizona convoy operation, Wade Morrison's security network had evolved into a sophisticated intelligence organization that used America's commercial transportation system to investigate criminal enterprises that targeted truckers and the cargo they transported. The network now included over 300 drivers across 12 states, all coordinating through encrypted communication systems and sharing intelligence about criminal activities that law enforcement agencies had failed to address effectively. Wade operated from a mobile command center built into his truck, using advanced communication equipment and data analysis systems to coordinate intelligence gathering operations throughout the western United States. His truck had become a rolling headquarters for a war that most Americans didn't know was being fought on their highways. The intelligence gathered by the network had revealed the true scope of the criminal organization that targeted commercial drivers. The operation extended far beyond simple truck hijacking or driver kidnapping. They were using the trucking industry as cover for transportation of illegal weapons, drugs, and human trafficking victims across the country. Wade was northbound on Interstate 15 through Utah when his intelligence systems intercepted communications that revealed the criminal organization's next major operation. Control Center, this is Operations Coordinator. Phase 3 implementation is authorized for the southwestern corridor. We have confirmed targets for elimination and recruitment across Nevada, Utah, and Colorado sectors. Wade immediately activated his network's emergency protocols, coordinating with cell leaders throughout the region to implement countermeasures against what appeared to be a coordinated attack on multiple drivers simultaneously. All network stations, this is Desert Fox with an emergency action alert. Hostile forces are implementing large-scale operations against network members. All drivers implement maximum security protocols and coordinate defensive responses. Rex Sullivan responded from Montana with intelligence about unusual vehicle movements throughout the northern corridors. Desert Fox, this is Mountain Man. We're detecting coordinated surveillance of network members throughout Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. Multiple teams are operating simultaneously. Dale Patterson coordinated response from Colorado and New Mexico. High Country confirms unusual activity throughout southwestern sectors. Criminal organizations appear to be targeting network leadership for simultaneous elimination. Curtis Miller provided coordination for drivers throughout Utah and Nevada. Harvest Moon reporting coordinated pursuit activities against at least 12 network members. This is the largest operation we've encountered. Wade realized that the criminal organization had decided to eliminate his entire network through coordinated attacks that would prevent the drivers from providing mutual assistance. The operation was designed to destroy the protective capabilities that had made it impossible for criminals to target individual truckers. Wade's intelligence systems detected electronic jamming beginning across multiple states simultaneously, indicating that the criminal organization was using military-level resources to isolate network members from each other. But Wade's network had anticipated this possibility and developed communication methods that didn't depend on electronic systems. Throughout the western states, drivers began implementing the visual signaling protocols and relay systems that allowed them to coordinate defensive responses even when radio communications were blocked. Blake Morrison, a network member from Texas, coordinated convoy formations throughout the southwestern corridors. All drivers, this is Lone Star. We're forming protective convoys on all major routes. Network members are to abandon scheduled deliveries and implement mutual protection protocols. Shane Mitchell, operating from New Mexico, established relay stations that used visual signals to coordinate information sharing across the jamming zones. This is high desert coordinating relay operations. We've got visual communication networks operating across I-40, I-25, and I-10 corridors. The battle that followed lasted 18 hours and involved hundreds of commercial vehicles coordinated through the most sophisticated defensive network ever organized by the trucking industry. Criminal pursuit teams found themselves facing coordinated convoy operations that made it impossible to isolate individual targets while generating enough documentation and witness testimony to expose their operations to law enforcement agencies. Wade's mobile command center became the focal point for coordinating the network's response to the largest criminal operation ever attempted against commercial drivers. His truck was surrounded by a protective convoy of over 60 commercial vehicles, all coordinated through communication systems that had overcome the criminals' electronic warfare capabilities. Troy Mansfield coordinated intelligence-gathering operations that documented the criminal organization's tactics and equipment. Desert Fox, this is Highway Guardian. We've identified at least 40 vehicles involved in coordinated pursuit operations, professional equipment, military tactics, resources that suggest major organizational backing. Jake Morrison provided liaison with law enforcement agencies that were responding to reports of coordinated criminal activity throughout multiple states. Desert Fox, this is Portland Express. State and federal agencies are mobilizing response teams throughout the region. Network operations have generated enough evidence to trigger major investigations. The criminal organization's coordinated attack ultimately failed because they had underestimated the trucking community's ability to organize defensive responses that didn't depend on the electronic systems they could jam. The visual communication networks, convoy tactics, and mutual protection protocols developed by Wade's network proved more effective than the sophisticated equipment used by their enemies. But the victory came at a significant cost. Several network members were injured during pursuit operations, multiple trucks were damaged, and the criminal organization had demonstrated capabilities that suggested access to military-level resources and intelligence. Wade realized that his network had won a battle, but was facing a war against enemies with resources that extended far beyond ordinary criminal enterprises. The systematic targeting of truckers, the coordination across multiple states, and the sophisticated equipment used against them suggested connections to organizations with government or military backing. During the post-operation debriefing, Dale Patterson provided intelligence analysis that revealed the disturbing scope of what they were fighting. The coordination, equipment, and resources we observed suggest an organization with access to military contractors or intelligence agencies. The electronic warfare capabilities, surveillance equipment, and tactical coordination exceed what criminal organizations typically possess. Rex Sullivan added information from his law enforcement contacts that confirmed the network's suspicions about institutional connections. Several federal agencies are investigating the disappearance of over 200 commercial drivers throughout the western states. The pattern suggests systematic recruitment or elimination of truckers for purposes that extend beyond ordinary criminal activities. Curtis Miller provided the most disturbing intelligence of all: evidence that the criminal organization was using kidnapped truck drivers to transport illegal cargo under the cover of legitimate commercial operations. Network intelligence indicates that missing drivers are being forced to transport weapons, drugs, and human trafficking victims across the country. Their legitimate credentials and commercial vehicles provide cover for illegal transportation operations. Wade understood that his network had uncovered a criminal enterprise that was exploiting America's commercial transportation system on a massive scale, using kidnapped drivers and stolen trucks to move illegal cargo without detection by law enforcement agencies. The network's success in defending against the coordinated attack had revealed their capabilities to the criminal organization, but it had also demonstrated that the trucking community possessed the resources and coordination necessary to fight back against systematic exploitation. Wade made a strategic decision that would determine the future of the conflict between his network and the criminal organization that had declared war on commercial drivers. All network leadership, this is Desert Fox with a strategic directive. We've proven that we can defend against their attacks, but defense alone won't eliminate the threat. We're shifting to offensive operations designed to gather evidence and expose the criminal organization to law enforcement agencies that can prosecute them effectively. The decision would transform the trucking industry's informal mutual aid network into an active intelligence organization capable of conducting operations against criminal enterprises that had infiltrated America's transportation system. Over the following months, Wade's network used the trucking industry's mobility and communication capabilities to gather evidence about the criminal organization's operations, leadership, and connections to legitimate institutions. The intelligence gathered by drivers throughout the western states provided law enforcement agencies with information that led to the arrests of over 40 individuals involved in trafficking operations. But the investigation also revealed that the criminal organization extended far beyond the individuals who had been captured. The network had uncovered a systematic exploitation of America's transportation industry that involved corruption in multiple government agencies, military contractors with illegal side operations, and criminal enterprises that had been operating with apparent immunity for years. Wade's network had succeeded in protecting commercial drivers from systematic exploitation, but they had also made enemies with resources and connections that ensured the conflict would continue indefinitely. The CB radio frequencies that connected truckers throughout the western states now carried two types of communications: coordination of legitimate commercial operations and intelligence sharing about criminal activities that threatened drivers and the cargo they transported. Wade continued operating his mobile command center, coordinating network operations, while hauling freight that helped support the intelligence activities that had become necessary for survival on America's highways. His truck remained surrounded by protective convoys and equipped with communication systems that allowed him to coordinate defensive operations across multiple states. Late at night, as Wade drove through the desert highways where his nightmare had begun, he could hear the voices of drivers who were carrying on the work that had evolved from his desperate flight from unknown pursuers. The network had grown beyond his ability to control or direct, becoming a permanent part of the trucking industry's response to systematic threats. But Wade also understood that his network's success had created new enemies, people whose criminal activities had been disrupted by the intelligence gathering and protective operations that bore his name. These enemies possessed resources and connections that made them more dangerous than the original criminal organization that had pursued him. The static between radio stations still carried whispers of coordination and planning from people who viewed Wade's network as an obstacle to be eliminated rather than a service to be respected. The war between predators and protectors on America's highways was escalating rather than ending. Wade Morrison had started something that had grown far beyond his original intent to protect truckers from criminal exploitation. His network had become a permanent fixture in the trucking industry, providing services that legitimate institutions had failed to offer while making enemies that legitimate institutions seemed unable or unwilling to prosecute. The midnight frequency still carried messages of coordination and mutual assistance between drivers who understood that their survival depended on their ability to protect each other from systematic exploitation. But it also carried the sounds of an ongoing war that would determine whether America's highways remained corridors of freedom and commerce, or whether they would become hunting grounds controlled by criminal organizations with resources that rivaled those of the government agencies that should have been protecting commercial transportation. Wade had survived his original encounter with the midnight frequency, but the frequency itself had become something that connected an entire industry in an ongoing struggle for survival against enemies who possessed capabilities that extended far beyond ordinary criminal enterprises. The Brotherhood of the Road had become a resistance movement that would never end, because the enemies they fought possessed resources and connections that ensured new threats would always emerge from the static between radio stations where America's truckers maintained their eternal vigilance against those who would exploit their industry and the drivers who kept the country's economy moving. Vehicles parked in the lot that weren't there when he checked the security cameras. His supervisor, a practical woman who'd never worked nights herself, dismissed the reports as stress and exhaustion. She suggested Marcus switch to day shifts, take a vacation, maybe see a doctor about possible sleep disorders. But Marcus knew what he was seeing was real. He started researching the history of the location, just like I had years earlier. He found the same newspaper articles about the old trading post, the same records of disappearances and strange incidents, and he began to understand that he was part of a pattern that stretched back much further than the existence of the modern truck stop. The night I approached him, he was doing inventory in the storage room, just like I had been during my last week at Rusty's Junction. He looked up when I walked in, and I could see in his eyes that he recognized me from his dreams. "You're one of them," he said. Not a question, just a statement of fact. "Yes," I told him. "And you're ready to choose." We talked for an hour about the old road, about the nature of the journey, about what it meant to step outside of linear time and become part of something eternal. Marcus asked intelligent questions, showed genuine understanding of what I was offering. In the end, he chose the old road, just as I had years earlier. He walked out of that storage room and into a world larger than anything he'd imagined possible. His supervisor found a resignation letter on her desk the next morning, typed and signed, giving 2 weeks' notice for personal reasons. But Marcus never showed up to work those final shifts. The security cameras showed him leaving the building that night, but they never showed him getting into a vehicle or walking to the parking lot. He simply walked toward the back of the building and vanished from their electronic record. The police investigated, of course. They interviewed his family, checked his bank accounts, analyzed his phone records. But people who choose the old road leave very few traces in your digital world. We exist between the spaces that your surveillance systems can monitor. That was 3 years ago. Marcus travels with us now, learning the routes that existed before maps, discovering destinations that don't appear in any guidebook. Like all of us, he's finding that the journey itself is more important than any specific destination. Which brings me to why I'm telling you this story now in such detail, with such specific warnings about the places and signs to watch for. The old road is becoming more active. The barriers between worlds are weakening, and the intersections where we can appear to travelers on the new road are becoming more numerous and more frequent. What used to happen once or twice a year at a given location is now happening monthly, sometimes weekly. More night shift workers are reporting unusual incidents. More families are disappearing from rest areas and truck stops. More drivers are abandoning their vehicles and walking away from lives they no longer want to live. The network of the old road is expanding, creating new connections, new crossroads, new opportunities for people to step out of linear time and into something eternal. And each person who makes that choice strengthens the network, makes it easier for others to see us, easier for the choice to be offered. I don't know why this is happening now. Maybe it's a natural cycle, something that occurs every few centuries when enough travelers have accumulated on the old road. Maybe it's a response to changes in your world, the increasing pace of life, the growing disconnection from the natural world, the sense that many people have of being trapped in lives that feel meaningless. Or maybe it's something else entirely, something connected to forces larger than human understanding. What I do know is that if you work nights at a truck stop, or a gas station, or any place where travelers pass through in the darkness, your chances of encountering us are higher now than they've been in decades. And if you start seeing things that don't quite make sense, if you start hearing voices that speak of impossible journeys, if you start noticing patterns that suggest something is operating just beyond the edge of your perception, you need to be prepared for the choice when it comes. Because it will come. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but if you've truly seen us, if you've genuinely witnessed the travelers on the old road, then you've already been marked. The connection has been made, and it will only grow stronger over time. You can fight it if you want. You can quit your job, move to a different city, try to convince yourself that what you saw wasn't real. Some people do that, and they manage to live out their lives without ever encountering us again. But they're never quite the same afterward. They carry the knowledge of our existence like a weight, always wondering what they might have experienced if they'd made a different choice. They see shadows that might be us in their peripheral vision. They hear whispers in empty rooms that might be our voices calling to them across the barriers between worlds. And sometimes, years later, when they're old and tired and feeling the weight of a life lived entirely within the boundaries of linear time, they start looking for us again. They drive the interstate highways late at night, stopping at truck stops and rest areas, hoping to catch a glimpse of the travelers they once turned away. By then, it's usually too late. The connection has weakened, the barriers have solidified, and the choice is no longer available to them. They die as they lived, trapped within the confines of ordinary existence, never knowing what wonders they might have seen if they'd been brave enough to step onto the old road when the opportunity was offered. That's why I'm telling you this story now, while you're still young enough and aware enough to understand what's being offered. That's why I'm giving you these warnings about the signs to watch for, the patterns to recognize, the choices you'll need to make. The old road welcomes all travelers, but it doesn't wait forever for anyone to decide. The choice, when it comes, must be made in the moment it's offered. There are no second chances, no opportunities to reconsider, no time to weigh the pros and cons. Either you step onto the old road and join the eternal journey, or you remain on the new road and live with the knowledge of what you've seen for the rest of your linear existence. Clay Henderson's Burgundy Peterbilt 379 rolled eastbound on Interstate 40 through the New Mexico darkness, its diesel engine maintaining a steady rhythm that had lulled Clay into the meditative state that came with 15 years of long-haul driving. At 38, the bearded trucker from Amarillo had learned to appreciate the solitude of night runs across the Southwest, when the desert highways were mostly empty except for other commercial drivers making their way between California and Texas. The digital clock on his dashboard read 11:42 p.m. As Clay passed the exit for Tucumcari, maintaining his cruise-controlled speed of 67 miles per hour while hauling a trailer load of furniture from Los Angeles to Dallas. It was a routine run he'd made dozens of times, following the same route, stopping at the same truck stops, keeping the same schedule that allowed him to maximize his driving hours while staying compliant with federal regulations. What Clay didn't realize was that his predictable routine had made him a target for someone who had been studying his movements for weeks. The first indication something was wrong came through his CB radio. Clay monitored Channel 19 out of habit, listening to the chatter between drivers about road conditions, speed traps, and the general conversation that helped break the monotony of long-distance driving. Most of the time, the radio provided useful information from other truckers who had traveled the road ahead and could warn about hazards or delays. At 11:47 p.m., Clay's radio crackled with a transmission that immediately got his attention. "Eastbound Peterbilt with the burgundy paint job. You got your ears on?" Clay glanced around at the sparse traffic surrounding him. There were only 3 other trucks visible in either direction, and one of them appeared to be the burgundy color mentioned in the transmission. Clay reached for his microphone. "That's a big 10-4. You got the burgundy, Pete. Go ahead." "Appreciate the comeback, driver. Looks like you might have a problem with your trailer lights. Your left rear running light appears to be out." Clay checked his instrument panel. No warning lights indicated any electrical problems, but trailer bulbs could burn out without triggering dashboard alerts. He made a mental note to check the lights at his next stop. "Much obliged for letting me know. I'll take a look when I stop for fuel." 10-4. Stay safe out there." The transmission ended, and Clay thought nothing more of it. Drivers routinely helped each other by reporting mechanical problems that might not be visible from the cab. It was part of the unwritten code of professional truckers looking out for each other on the highway. 20 minutes later, as Clay approached the truck stop where he planned to fuel up, his CB crackled again. "Burgundy Pete, this is that driver who called about your trailer light. You still eastbound?" Clay was surprised to hear from the same driver again. Usually, such communications were brief, one-time interactions. "That's a big 10-4, just pulling into the Flying J for fuel." "Roger that. I'm about 10 minutes behind you. Thought I'd mention that light's still out, and now it looks like you might have a loose mud flap on that same side." Clay felt a slight uneasiness. For another driver to observe that level of detail about his truck, they would have to be following fairly closely and paying unusual attention to his trailer. Most drivers were focused on their own rigs and the road ahead, not conducting detailed inspections of other trucks. "Appreciate the heads up. I'll check it out." Clay pulled into the Flying J and parked at the fuel island. As he began filling his tanks, he walked around to examine the rear of his trailer. The running lights appeared to be functioning normally, and the mud flaps were securely attached. Either the problems had corrected themselves, or they had never existed in the first place. As Clay completed his fueling, he noticed a dark-colored Kenworth pulling into the truck stop. The truck was too far away for Clay to see the driver clearly, but something about the timing and positioning suggested it might be the driver who had been reporting problems with Clay's trailer. Clay completed his fuel purchase and pulled his truck to the parking area to take his mandatory 30-minute break. As he shut down his engine and prepared to log the break time, he noticed the dark Kenworth had parked several spaces away, positioned so that the driver could observe Clay's truck without being obvious about it. Clay's military training from his Army days began to assert itself. He'd served as a military policeman for 6 years before becoming a trucker, and he'd learned to recognize surveillance patterns and unusual behavior. The level of attention his truck was receiving from another driver was beginning to feel like more than casual road courtesy. Clay decided to test his suspicions. Instead of taking a full break, he logged back into driving status after 15 minutes and pulled back onto Interstate 40. If the dark Kenworth followed him immediately, it would confirm that he was being tracked. As Clay merged back into traffic, he watched his mirrors carefully. Within 2 minutes, he could see headlights from the dark Kenworth pulling out of the truck stop behind him. The timing was too coincidental for normal trucking operations. Clay's uneasiness increased as he continued eastbound. The following truck maintained a consistent distance of about a quarter mile, close enough to keep Clay's truck in sight, but far enough back to avoid appearing obviously suspicious. Over the next hour, Clay tested the situation by varying his speed slightly. Each time, the following truck adjusted its speed to maintain the same distance. At 1:20 a.m., Clay's CB radio came to life again. "Burgundy Pete, you still got your ears on?" Clay hesitated before responding. The voice sounded like the same driver who had been reporting mechanical problems, but now the communication felt more sinister than helpful. "Go ahead. Looks like you're making good time tonight, running a pretty steady pace." The comment sent a chill down Clay's spine. The driver was clearly monitoring Clay's speed and travel patterns with an attention to detail that went well beyond normal driver-to-driver communication. "Just trying to stay on schedule," Clay replied, keeping his response brief. "I hear you. Long way to go before morning. Lot of empty road between here and Amarillo." Clay didn't respond to the transmission. The mention of his destination was particularly troubling, since Clay hadn't broadcast his route or intended stops. Either the driver was guessing based on common trucking routes, or he had access to information about Clay's trip that should have been confidential. Over the next 30 miles, the following truck gradually closed the distance, moving from a quarter-mile back to about 500 yards behind Clay's trailer. Still not close enough to be considered tailgating, but close enough that Clay could see the truck clearly in his mirrors, even in the darkness. Clay began to consider his options. He could pull into another truck stop and see if the following driver would reveal his intentions. He could exit the interstate and take alternate routes to determine if he was really being followed. Or he could continue on his planned route and hope that his concerns were unfounded. The decision was made for him at 2:15 a.m. when his CB radio crackled with a transmission that made his blood run cold. "Clay Henderson, driving the Burgundy Pete with Texas plates, hauling furniture to Dallas. You've got a real nice setup there, driver." Clay had never given his name over the radio. His truck's license plates weren't visible from the following vehicle's position, and his cargo information wasn't something that could be observed from outside his truck. The driver was demonstrating knowledge of Clay's identity and trip details that could only have come from inside information or extensive surveillance. Clay reached for his cell phone to call 911, but realized he was in one of the dead zones common along I-40 where cell coverage was spotty or non-existent. His CB radio was his only reliable communication, and that channel was apparently being monitored by whoever was following him. Clay made a decision that potentially saved his life. Instead of continuing on his planned route toward Amarillo, he took the next exit and headed north on a state highway that led away from the interstate. If he was being followed for legitimate reasons, the other driver would probably continue eastbound. If his fears were justified, the following truck would take the same exit. Clay watched his mirrors as he climbed the exit ramp. The dark Kenworth followed him off the interstate, confirming that Clay was being deliberately tracked by someone with knowledge of his identity and travel plans. The state highway was nearly deserted at 2:30 in the morning, with only occasional ranch access roads and no services for miles. Clay realized that he had potentially made his situation worse by isolating himself on a road where help would be even harder to find than on the interstate. But Clay also recognized that he now had confirmation of what he was dealing with. Someone had been studying his routes and schedule, gathering information about his cargo and destination, and was now actively pursuing him on highways where they could operate without witnesses. Clay's CB radio crackled again, and this time the voice carried a different tone, less friendly, more businesslike. "Mr. Henderson, you're making this more complicated than it needs to be. Pull over at the next opportunity so we can have a conversation." Clay didn't respond, but he pressed down on his accelerator, pushing his loaded truck to its maximum safe speed on the winding state highway. Behind him, the pursuing Kenworth also accelerated, closing the distance between the two trucks. For the next 20 miles, Clay found himself in a high-speed chase through the New Mexico countryside, his heavily loaded truck struggling to maintain speed on the rolling hills, while the pursuing vehicle gradually gained ground. Clay's diesel engine was working hard, his transmission downshifting automatically as he climbed grades, while his pursuer seemed to have no trouble matching his pace. At 3:10 a.m., Clay crested a hill and saw something that gave him hope: the lights of a small town ahead. If he could reach the town, he might find help, or at least witnesses who could document what was happening to him. But as Clay descended toward the town, he realized that the pursuing truck had closed to within 100 yards of his trailer, close enough that Clay could see the driver's silhouette in the other truck's cab, close enough that any aggressive maneuvering by the pursuer could force Clay off the road. Clay's military training told him that he was in a tactical situation where his options were limited, and his opponent held most of the advantages. The pursuing driver had demonstrated superior knowledge of Clay's operations, better intelligence about the terrain, and a truck that was apparently lighter and more maneuverable than Clay's loaded rig. But Clay also had advantages that his pursuer might not expect. 15 years of professional driving had given Clay intimate knowledge of truck handling and performance characteristics. His military police training had taught him evasion and defensive driving techniques, and his determination to survive was strengthened by the knowledge that he had a teenage daughter who depended on him. As Clay entered the outskirts of the small town, he made a decision that would determine whether he lived or died. Instead of continuing straight through town where the pursuing truck could easily follow, Clay took a sharp right turn onto a side street, using his truck's momentum and the pursuer's following distance to create a brief gap between the two vehicles. The maneuver worked temporarily. Clay gained about 200 yards on his pursuer, who had to slow down and turn around to follow the unexpected route change. But Clay also realized that he was now on unfamiliar roads in a strange town, with no idea where the streets led or whether he would find help or just get himself trapped in a dead end. Clay's CB radio crackled with an angry transmission. "Mr. Henderson, you're just delaying the inevitable. Stop running and let's settle this like professionals." The word professionals sent another chill through Clay. Whatever was happening to him wasn't random road rage or simple robbery. He was being hunted by someone who considered this kind of pursuit to be professional work. As Clay navigated the dark streets of the unknown town, he began to understand that his encounter with the stalker was just the beginning of something much worse. Someone had identified him as a target, studied his patterns, and was now implementing a plan that required Clay to be stopped and captured. The question was why Clay had been selected, and what the professional pursuing him intended to do once the chase was over. Clay's burgundy Peterbilt thundered through the narrow streets of the sleeping town, his diesel engine echoing off the closed storefronts and darkened houses as he searched desperately for escape routes or refuge. In his mirrors, he could see the headlights of the pursuing Kenworth gaining ground, the driver apparently more familiar with the town's layout than Clay was. At 3:25 a.m., Clay spotted what appeared to be a 24-hour gas station with lights on and a patrol car parked near the entrance. Clay immediately steered toward the station, hoping to find help from the police officer or at least create witnesses who could document his pursuit. But as he pulled into the station's lot, Clay realized the patrol car was empty, probably belonging to an officer who was inside on a coffee break. Clay parked his truck near the station entrance and ran inside, his heart pounding from the adrenaline of the chase. Behind the counter, a young clerk was reading a magazine, apparently unaware of the drama that had just arrived in his parking lot. "I need help," Clay said urgently. "Someone's been following me for over an hour. I need to call the police." The clerk looked up with the bored expression of someone accustomed to dealing with truckers who stopped for fuel and snacks. "Phone's over there by the restroom. Local police or state patrol?" Before Clay could answer, he heard the distinctive sound of the pursuing truck's diesel engine pulling into the station lot. Through the windows, Clay could see the dark Kenworth positioning itself to block Clay's truck from leaving the station. "State Patrol," Clay said, moving toward the phone. "And tell me there's a back exit from this place. Loading dock out back, but it's locked after hours." Clay dialed the New Mexico State Police emergency number while watching through the windows as a figure climbed down from the pursuing truck. The man was average height, wearing jeans and a baseball cap, and appeared to be in his 40s. From a distance, he looked like any other truck driver making a late-night fuel stop. The state patrol dispatcher answered on the second ring. "State Police, what's your emergency?" "This is Clay Henderson. I'm a commercial truck driver being pursued by an unknown individual on Highway 209 near... What town is this?" Clay looked at the clerk, who answered, "Vaughn. Near Vaughn, New Mexico. The subject has been following me for over an hour and has demonstrated knowledge of my personal information and cargo. I'm currently at a gas station, but the subject is approaching the building." "Mr. Henderson, I'm dispatching units to your location. Can you describe the pursuing vehicle?" Clay provided the description of the dark Kenworth while watching the approaching figure through the station windows. The man was walking casually toward the entrance, as if he was simply another customer stopping for fuel or snacks. "Sir, I need you to stay on the line and avoid confrontation if possible. Units are en route. Estimated arrival in 12 minutes. 12 minutes felt like an eternity as Clay watched the man approach the station entrance. Clay moved away from the windows, positioning himself near the back of the store where he could observe the front entrance while staying out of direct sight. The door chimed as the man entered the station. Clay could hear his footsteps moving toward the counter, his voice casual and friendly as he spoke to the clerk. "Evening. You wouldn't happen to have seen another trucker come in here in the last few minutes, driving a burgundy Peterbilt? I've been trying to catch up with him to return his wallet. Must have dropped it at the last truck stop." Clay felt his stomach tighten. The story was plausible enough that the clerk might innocently reveal Clay's location, but Clay was certain that no wallet had been dropped and that the man's intentions were far from helpful. "Yeah, he's right back there using the phone," the clerk replied, pointing toward Clay's location. Clay realized he had seconds to decide whether to confront the man, try to escape through the back of the store, or trust that the approaching state patrol units would arrive before the situation escalated. The man began walking toward the back of the store, his footsteps casual but purposeful. Clay could see him reflected in the security mirror mounted in the corner. Average build, unremarkable appearance, but moving with the confidence of someone accustomed to controlling situations. "Mr. Henderson?" the man called out. "I believe you dropped your wallet at the Flying J. Thought you'd want it back." Clay didn't respond, but he noticed that the man's hands were positioned near his waistband in a way that suggested he was carrying a concealed weapon. Clay's military training told him that the situation was about to become violent. "Look, driver, I know you're back there. This can be easy or it can be hard, but either way, we're going to have a conversation." Clay made his decision. Instead of waiting to be cornered, he stepped into view while maintaining distance from the man. "I didn't drop any wallet, and I don't know who you are, but you need to stay away from me." The man smiled, but his eyes remained cold and calculating. "Clay Henderson, age 38, divorced. One daughter named Emma, who lives with your ex-wife in Amarillo. You drive for Southwestern Freight, been with the company for 8 years, clean driving record. You run the Los Angeles to Dallas route twice a week, usually departing Sunday night and Thursday night." Clay felt a chill as the man recited personal details that should have been confidential. This wasn't a random encounter or a case of mistaken identity. Clay had been specifically researched and targeted by someone with access to employment records and personal information. "What do you want?" "I want you to walk outside to your truck and drive to a location where we can have a private conversation. No state police, no witnesses, no complications." Clay could hear sirens approaching in the distance, the state patrol units responding to his 911 call. But he also realized that the man had positioned himself between Clay and the front exit, and that running toward the back of the store would only trap Clay in a dead end. "I'm not going anywhere with you." The man's expression hardened, and Clay could see him shifting his weight in preparation for aggressive action. "Mr. Henderson, you have a choice. You can walk outside voluntarily, or I can make you walk outside. Either way, we're leaving this store before those police units arrive." Clay noticed that the store clerk had become aware that something was wrong and was moving toward a phone behind the counter, probably to call for additional help. But Clay also realized that the young man could become a victim if the situation escalated into violence. "Why me?" Clay asked, trying to buy time while the sirens grew louder. "What makes me a target?" "You fit the profile. Solo driver, predictable routes, limited family connections that would generate immediate searches if you disappeared. You're exactly what we're looking for." The word disappeared confirmed Clay's worst fears about the man's intentions. This wasn't about robbery or cargo theft. It was about abduction, possibly murder. Clay was being hunted by someone who had developed criteria for selecting victims among long-haul truck drivers. Clay could now see the flashing lights of approaching police vehicles through the station windows. The cavalry was almost there, but Clay had to survive the next 60 seconds without being killed or taken hostage. The man apparently realized that his window of opportunity was closing. He reached under his jacket and produced a compact pistol, holding it low and close to his body so that it wouldn't be visible to the clerk or anyone outside the store. "Mr. Henderson, we're walking outside right now. If you make any noise or try to alert those police officers, I'll shoot you and anyone else in this store. Do you understand?" Clay understood that he was dealing with a predator who was prepared to kill multiple people to achieve his objectives. The threat against the innocent store clerk made compliance seem like the only option that wouldn't result in immediate bloodshed. But Clay also understood that leaving the store with the armed man would almost certainly result in his own death, probably after whatever conversation the man had planned. Clay had to make a choice between immediate danger to others and certain death for himself. Clay made the decision that his military training had prepared him for. He chose to fight rather than submit to an armed predator. As the man gestured toward the front door with his pistol, Clay suddenly lunged forward, grabbing the man's gun hand and driving his shoulder into the attacker's midsection. The two men crashed into a display rack, sending merchandise scattering across the floor as they struggled for control of the weapon. The store clerk shouted and dove behind the counter as the gun discharged twice, the shots echoing through the building and shattering bottles on the shelves. Clay maintained his grip on the attacker's wrist, using his superior size and weight to control the weapon while trying to disarm his opponent. The front door burst open as state patrol officers responded to the gunshots, their own weapons drawn and ready. "Police! Drop the weapon!" The attacker realized that his situation had become hopeless. Instead of surrendering, he made a final desperate attempt to complete his mission by turning the gun toward Clay's head at point-blank range. Clay twisted away from the barrel just as the weapon fired again, the bullet passing close enough to his skull that he could feel the heat and concussion of the muzzle blast. Clay's counterattack drove his elbow into the attacker's throat, stunning him long enough for the state patrol officers to move in and secure the weapon. Within seconds, the man was handcuffed and on the floor, while Clay found himself shaking from adrenaline and the realization of how close he had come to death. The store clerk emerged from behind the counter, wide-eyed but uninjured, while the police officers secured the scene and called for medical assistance. As Clay gave his statement to the investigating officers, he learned something that made his blood run cold. The man who had been hunting him was carrying identification for Dale Morrison, but a quick records check revealed that the real Dale Morrison had been reported missing 3 months earlier after disappearing from a truck stop in Arizona. Clay realized that his attacker was using the identity of a murdered truck driver, suggesting that Clay's encounter was part of a much larger pattern of crimes targeting commercial drivers. The man's knowledge of trucking operations, his familiarity with highway routes, and his ability to impersonate legitimate drivers all pointed to a systematic hunting operation that had probably been claiming victims for months or years. The arrested suspect refused to answer questions about his identity or motives, invoking his right to remain silent and requesting an attorney. But Clay noticed something disturbing during the booking process. The man showed no signs of stress or concern about his arrest. He appeared calm and confident, as if he expected to be released or rescued. Detective Maria Santos arrived at the scene at 5:30 a.m. to take over the investigation. Santos was a veteran investigator with the New Mexico State Police, and she immediately recognized the significance of Clay's encounter. "Mr. Henderson, you may have just helped us solve a series of disappearances that we've been investigating for over a year," Santos told Clay as they reviewed the incident. 3 truck drivers have disappeared along I-40 in the past 18 months, all under circumstances that suggested they were specifically targeted. Clay described his encounter with the suspect, including the man's detailed knowledge of his personal information and travel patterns. As Clay spoke, Santos's expression grew increasingly serious. "The level of surveillance you describe suggests a sophisticated operation. Someone has been studying truck drivers' routes and schedules, gathering intelligence that would allow them to predict when and where specific drivers would be vulnerable to attack. Detective, this guy mentioned that I fit a profile. He said I was exactly what they were looking for. That suggests there are others involved in this." Santos nodded grimly. "That's what we're afraid of. The suspect you encountered may be part of a larger network that's been targeting commercial drivers throughout the Southwest." As Clay prepared to continue his journey to Dallas, he realized that his ordeal was far from over. If the suspect was part of an organized group, other members of the organization might try to retaliate against Clay for disrupting their operation. Clay's identity and involvement in the arrest would become part of the public record, making him a target for anyone connected to the network. Detective Santos provided Clay with contact information and security recommendations, but she also warned him that the investigation was likely to reveal information that would put Clay at continued risk. "Mr. Henderson, you've helped us capture one predator, but we don't know how many others are still out there. I strongly recommend that you vary your routes and schedules until we can determine the full scope of this operation." As Clay climbed back into his burgundy Peterbilt and prepared to continue eastbound on I-40, he understood that his life as a trucker had been permanently changed. The highways that had once represented freedom and independence now felt like hunting grounds where predators studied their prey and planned attacks with military precision. Clay had survived his encounter with one such predator, but the man's final words echoed in his mind. "You're exactly what we're looking for." The question that haunted Clay as he drove through the dawn light was whether other drivers who fit the same profile were still out there, unaware that they were being hunted by people who understood their routines, their vulnerabilities, and their isolation on America's highways. 3 weeks after his encounter with the fake Dale Morrison, Clay Henderson was back on Interstate 40, hauling automotive parts from Phoenix to Little Rock. Despite Detective Santos's warnings about varying his routes, Clay's mortgage payments and his daughter's school expenses demanded that he maintain his regular schedule. The economic reality of trucking meant that most drivers couldn't afford to avoid their most profitable routes, even when those routes had become hunting grounds for predators. Clay had made several modifications to his truck and procedures since the Vaughn incident. He'd installed a dash camera system that recorded continuously, upgraded his CB radio with recording capability, and programmed emergency numbers into speed dial on his cell phone. Most importantly, he'd changed his CB call sign and begun monitoring multiple channels simultaneously to detect anyone tracking his communications. At 1:30 a.m., as Clay passed through the same stretch of New Mexico where he'd been stalked, his CB radio picked up a conversation that made his blood run cold. "Eastbound company driver in the white Freightliner, mile marker 287, you copy?" Clay wasn't driving a white Freightliner, but he could see one about a mile ahead of him in the eastbound lanes. He switched his CB to record mode and listened carefully to the exchange. "Go ahead, driver. Looks like you might have a problem with your brake lights. Right side appears to be intermittent." Clay felt his stomach tighten. The conversation was following exactly the same pattern his stalker had used. A helpful driver reporting mechanical problems that probably didn't exist, establishing contact with a target who was traveling alone. "Thanks for the heads up. I'll check it at my next stop." 10-4. That next truck stop is about 15 miles ahead. Good place to take a look. Clay immediately called Detective Santos on his cell phone. The investigation into the fake Dale Morrison had stalled when the suspect continued refusing to provide his real identity or cooperate with interrogation. But Santos had warned Clay that other members of the organization were likely still active. Detective Santos. Detective, this is Clay Henderson. I'm on I-40 and I think I'm witnessing another stalking attempt. Different target truck, but the exact same method my attacker used. Santos was immediately alert. What's your location and what are you observing? Clay described the CB conversation and provided his current position. Santos told him that state patrol units would be dispatched to monitor the situation, but the nearest unit was at least 20 minutes away. Mr. Henderson, do not attempt to intervene directly. Document everything you can, but maintain your distance from both vehicles. Clay continued monitoring the CB as the white Freightliner maintained its eastbound course. The helpful driver continued making periodic transmissions, gradually building rapport with the target and gathering information about his route and schedule. At 1:45 a.m., Clay heard a transmission that confirmed his worst fears. White Freightliner, this is that driver who called about your brake lights. Looks like you're running solo tonight. Long haul gets lonely, doesn't it? The question was inappropriate for normal driver-to-driver communication. Professional truckers might discuss road conditions, weather, or mechanical issues, but they rarely made personal inquiries about other drivers' situations or emotional state. Yeah, it's a long run, but the miles pay the bills. I hear you, driver. What's your destination, if you don't mind me asking? Clay knew that no legitimate trucker would ask another driver about cargo destinations. The question was clearly designed to gather intelligence for an attack, just as Clay's stalker had done. Clay made a decision that violated Detective Santos's instructions, but potentially saved a life. He switched to the CB channel where the conversation was taking place and interrupted the exchange. Break 19, break 19. White Freightliner eastbound near mile marker 290. This is another eastbound driver about 2 miles behind you. That driver asking about your destination isn't following normal CB protocol. Recommend you avoid providing personal information. Clay's transmission created an immediate change in the dynamic. The stalker's voice came back with obvious irritation. Driver, you need to stay out of other people's conversations. This is between me and the Freightliner. Clay recognized something disturbing in the stalker's response. The voice pattern and speech cadence were similar to his original attacker, but not identical. This suggested that multiple people were using the same methodology to target truck drivers. The white Freightliner's driver seemed to understand the warning. Appreciate the heads up, driver. I'm going to monitor channel 17 if anyone needs to reach me. The Freightliner driver had switched to an alternate channel, cutting off the stalker's ability to communicate with him directly. Clay switched to channel 17 and made contact with the potential victim. White Freightliner, this is the eastbound Pete that warned you about the suspicious communications. I had a similar experience 3 weeks ago that turned into a serious situation. What kind of serious situation? Clay briefly described his encounter with the fake Dale Morrison, emphasizing that the stalker had possessed detailed personal information and had attempted armed abduction. Holy shit, the Freightliner driver replied. That driver knew I was running alone, and he asked about my cargo and destination. Same pattern you're describing. Clay advised the other driver to contact state police immediately and to avoid stopping at isolated locations until law enforcement could respond to the threat. But as they talked, Clay noticed something disturbing in his mirrors. A single set of headlights was approaching from behind at high speed, gaining on Clay's truck despite his steady pace. Clay's CB radio crackled with an angry transmission on channel 19. Eastbound Pete driver who's been interfering with other people's business. You need to mind your own affairs. Keep running your mouth and you're going to have problems. Clay realized that his intervention had made him a target for retaliation. The stalker had apparently been monitoring multiple CB channels and had identified Clay as the driver who had disrupted the hunting attempt. The approaching headlights were now close enough for Clay to see that they belonged to a large truck, possibly the same stalker who had been pursuing the white freightliner. Clay found himself in the same situation he'd experienced weeks earlier, being hunted by someone with superior intelligence and resources. Clay called Detective Santos again and reported the escalating situation. Santos told him that state patrol units were converging on the area, but Clay's position on a remote stretch of highway meant that help was still 15 minutes away. "Mr. Henderson, you need to reach a populated area or a location with reliable backup. Do not allow yourself to be isolated." But Clay's options were limited. The nearest exit was 10 miles ahead, and the pursuing truck was steadily closing the distance. Clay could see in his mirrors that the stalker was now less than 200 yards behind his trailer and appeared to be preparing for aggressive maneuvering. Clay's CB radio erupted with transmissions from multiple sources, suggesting that several drivers were monitoring the situation and trying to provide assistance. "Eastbound Pete, this is a westbound driver at mile marker 295. I can see your situation from the opposite side. State police are about 5 minutes out." "Pete driver, this is another eastbound truck about 10 miles ahead of you. There's a state patrol way station at mile marker 305 that should be open." Clay pushed his loaded truck to maximum safe speed while the pursuing vehicle continued to close ground. The stalker was now close enough that Clay could see the distinctive profile of a Peterbilt similar to his own truck, painted in dark colors that made it difficult to distinguish in the darkness. At 2:15 a.m., the pursuing truck moved into the left lane and began to pull alongside Clay's trailer. Clay could see a figure in the other truck's cab making gestures toward the shoulder, apparently ordering Clay to pull over. Clay maintained his course and speed, knowing that stopping would put him at the mercy of someone who had already demonstrated violent intentions. But he also realized that the stalker might attempt to force him off the road, using the same tactics that had been used against the white freightliner. The pursuing truck accelerated and moved ahead of Clay's cab, then began to slow down while positioned in the left lane. The maneuver was designed to reduce Clay's speed and create an opportunity for additional attack vehicles to join the pursuit. Clay's training and experience told him that he was dealing with a coordinated operation involving multiple vehicles and drivers. The stalker wasn't acting alone. He was part of a network that could field multiple trucks and coordinate attacks against targeted drivers. Clay's CB radio crackled with another transmission that confirmed his fears. "We've got the eastbound Pete boxed in near mile marker 298, moving to intercept." Clay realized that other members of the stalking network were positioning themselves ahead of his location, probably at the upcoming exit or way station where Clay had hoped to find refuge. Clay made a desperate decision. Instead of continuing eastbound toward the trap that was being prepared for him, he took the next available exit and headed south on a state highway, hoping to evade the coordinated pursuit by leaving the interstate system entirely. The maneuver caught the stalkers off guard temporarily. Clay gained about a half-mile lead as the pursuing trucks had to slow down and reorganize their pursuit on the unfamiliar secondary roads. But Clay also realized that he was now in even more isolated territory, where help would be harder to find and the stalkers could operate with less concern about witnesses. Over the next 20 minutes, Clay found himself in a high-speed chase through rural New Mexico, his heavily loaded truck struggling to maintain speed on winding roads, while multiple pursuing vehicles gradually closed the distance. Clay's CB radio carried fragmentary transmissions from the stalkers as they coordinated their pursuit and planned their attack. "Target is southbound on Highway 54, approximately 2 miles south of the interstate. Unit 2 is moving to intercept at the intersection with County Road 18. Unit 3 is approaching from the east on Highway 60. Clay realized that he was being herded toward a specific location where multiple attack vehicles would converge on his truck. The stalkers had apparently scouted the local road network and identified choke points where a fleeing vehicle could be trapped and captured. Clay's only advantage was his intimate knowledge of truck handling and his determination to survive. But he was facing multiple opponents with superior local knowledge, better communications, and apparent experience in conducting coordinated vehicle pursuits. At 2:40 a.m., Clay crested a hill and saw something that gave him both hope and terror. The lights of a small town were visible ahead, promising the possibility of help and witnesses. But Clay could also see the headlights of trucks positioned at what appeared to be the main intersections leading into town. The stalkers had anticipated Clay's route and established blocking positions that would prevent him from reaching potential refuge. Clay was being driven into a trap that had been carefully prepared by people who understood both the terrain and their prey's likely behavior. Clay's CB radio crackled with a final transmission from the lead stalker. "End of the road, driver. Time to have that conversation we've been trying to arrange." Clay realized that he had reached the moment when his survival would depend on whatever resources and skills he could bring to bear against a network of predators who had been refining their hunting methods for months or years. The question was whether Clay Henderson possessed the knowledge and determination to defeat an organization that had apparently never failed to capture their intended prey. Clay's burgundy Peterbilt approached the small town of Carrizozo at 2:45 a.m., with 3 sets of headlights converging on his position from different directions. The stalkers had coordinated their pursuit with military precision, using their knowledge of local roads to establish a perimeter that would trap Clay regardless of which route he chose to escape. But Clay had one advantage that the stalkers hadn't anticipated. His military police training had included tactical driving and evasion techniques designed for situations where conventional law enforcement backup was unavailable. Clay was prepared to fight rather than submit to capture by people who had already demonstrated lethal intentions. Instead of entering the town where the blocking vehicles waited, Clay suddenly braked hard and executed a U-turn on the narrow highway, using his truck's momentum and the stalkers' following distance to reverse direction before they could react. The maneuver was dangerous with a loaded trailer, but Clay managed to maintain control while creating a gap between his truck and the pursuing vehicles. The sudden course change caught the stalkers completely off guard. Clay could hear urgent transmissions on his CB radio as they tried to reorganize their pursuit and reposition their blocking vehicles. "Target has reversed course, heading north on 54. All units adjust intercept positions. Unit 2, can you reach the Highway 380 intersection?" "Negative. He's got too much lead time." Clay's tactical thinking told him that the stalkers' coordination was both their strength and their weakness. Their ability to communicate and coordinate gave them superior hunting capabilities, but it also made them dependent on electronic communications that could be monitored and potentially disrupted. Clay switched his CB to scan mode, monitoring all channels simultaneously to track the stalkers' communications. Over the next few minutes, he was able to piece together their organizational structure and tactical procedures. The stalkers were using at least 4 vehicles in the immediate pursuit, with additional units positioned at strategic locations throughout the region. They had established a command center that was coordinating the hunt and providing intelligence about Clay's movements and potential escape routes. But Clay also detected something in their communications that gave him hope. The stalkers were becoming frustrated and disorganized as Clay's evasion tactics disrupted their carefully planned operation. Their transmissions carried increasing urgency and anger, suggesting that they were accustomed to easier captures. At 3:10 a.m., Clay reached the intersection with Interstate 40 and had to decide whether to return to the main highway where state patrol units might provide assistance, or continue on secondary roads where he could potentially outmaneuver the pursuing trucks. Clay chose the interstate, gambling that the stalkers would be reluctant to continue their pursuit on a major highway where their activities would be more visible to law enforcement and other drivers. The gamble paid off initially. As Clay merged eastbound onto I-40, the pursuing vehicles fell back to more discreet following distances, apparently unwilling to conduct aggressive maneuvers on the busier highway. But Clay's relief was short-lived. At 3:25 a.m., his CB radio crackled with a transmission that revealed the true scope of the operation he had stumbled into. "Control Center, this is Pursuit Team Alpha. Target has returned to I-40 eastbound. Recommend activating Phase 2 protocols." "Roger, Alpha. Phase 2 is authorized. Units 7 through 12 are being deployed to establish intercept positions between Tucumcari and Amarillo." Clay realized that the stalking network wasn't just a local operation involving a few trucks. The organization had resources positioned across hundreds of miles of highway, with enough vehicles and personnel to conduct sustained operations against multiple targets simultaneously. Clay's CB radio continued to carry fragments of the stalkers' communications as they implemented their expanded pursuit plan. "Unit 7 is positioning at the Tucumcari truck stop to monitor eastbound commercial traffic. Units 9 and 10 are establishing checkpoints at the rest areas near Adrian and Glen Rio. Control Center advises that target has military background and tactical driving experience. Consider him extremely dangerous and non-compliant." Clay was disturbed to learn that the stalkers had access to his military service records and were using that information to plan their tactics. The level of intelligence gathering suggested connections to databases and information sources that should have been restricted to law enforcement agencies. At 3:45 a.m., Clay's CB radio received a direct transmission on his truck's specific channel frequency. "Clay Henderson, Nevada CDL number N479152, driving Burgundy Peterbilt with Texas plates. We know who you are, where you live, where your daughter goes to school. Stop running, and this ends with just you. Keep running, and we expand the target list." The threat against his daughter Emma made Clay's decision for him. He couldn't continue leading the stalkers on a chase that might result in retaliation against his family. Clay had to end the pursuit in a way that would eliminate the threat permanently. Clay called Detective Santos and reported the escalating situation and the direct threats against his family. Santos told him that the FBI had joined the investigation after linking Clay's original attacker to similar crimes in 4 other states. "Mr. Henderson, we've discovered that truck driver disappearances matching this pattern have been occurring throughout the Southwest for over 3 years. We believe you've encountered a sophisticated human trafficking organization that specifically targets commercial drivers." Human trafficking? Clay was stunned by the revelation. Commercial drivers fit the profile perfectly for trafficking operations. They're accustomed to irregular schedules and long absences. They often have limited family connections, and their disappearances might not be immediately reported or investigated. The organization appears to be kidnapping drivers and forcing them to transport contraband or victims. Clay realized that the fake Dale Morrison and his network weren't just killing truck drivers. They were enslaving them, using their knowledge and credentials to move illegal cargo across the country, while the original drivers remained captive or were eliminated when they were no longer useful. "Detective, they've threatened my daughter. I need to end this tonight before they have a chance to follow through." Santos understood Clay's position, but she also warned him that the FBI was still gathering intelligence on the scope of the trafficking network. "Mr. Henderson, we don't know how many people are involved or what resources they have. You can't take on this organization alone." But Clay had already made his decision. He would use the stalkers' own tactics against them, drawing them into a confrontation where their superior numbers and coordination would be neutralized by terrain and tactical positioning. Clay took the exit at Tucumcari and headed north on Highway 104, leading the pursuing vehicles toward Conchas Lake, a remote recreational area where the road network was limited and escape routes were few. If Clay could force a confrontation in terrain that favored defensive positions over mobile tactics, he might be able to level the playing field. The stalkers followed him off the interstate, apparently convinced that Clay was simply trying another evasion route. Their CB communications indicated confidence that they could trap Clay in the dead-end roads around the lake area. Target is heading toward Conscious Lake. Limited exit routes available. All units move to blocking positions. Clay drove to the boat launch area at the lake and parked his truck facing the water with his back against the shoreline. The position eliminated the stalker's ability to surround his truck, forcing them to approach from a limited number of directions where Clay could observe their movements. As Clay waited for the confrontation, he used his CB radio to broadcast a continuous transmission describing his location and the threats he was facing. The transmission was being recorded on multiple channels and would provide evidence of what happened regardless of the outcome. This is Clay Henderson, CDL number N4791582. I'm at Conscious Lake, New Mexico, being pursued by members of a human trafficking organization that has been kidnapping truck drivers throughout the Southwest. If something happens to me, the FBI needs to investigate this network and protect my daughter Emma Henderson in Amarillo, Texas. At 4:20 a.m., the first stalker vehicles appeared at the boat launch, their headlights illuminating Clay's truck and the surrounding area. Clay counted at least 6 trucks positioned to prevent his escape, with additional vehicles probably stationed on the access roads. Clay's CB radio crackled with a final transmission from the lead stalker. "Mr. Henderson, you've caused us significant inconvenience tonight. Step out of your truck, and we'll discuss how you can make amends for the problems you've created." Clay didn't respond, but he prepared for what he knew would be his final confrontation with the trafficking network. Through his windshield, he could see armed figures moving between the stalker vehicles, positioning themselves for an assault on his truck. Clay's military training told him that his defensive position was strong, but not sustainable. The stalkers had superior numbers and firepower, and they could maintain their siege indefinitely while Clay's resources were limited to whatever supplies he carried in his truck. But Clay also knew something that the stalkers didn't. His continuous CB transmission was being monitored by the FBI, state police, and possibly other truckers who might provide assistance or witness testimony. The stalkers' own communications were being recorded and would provide evidence of their organization and methods. At 4:35 a.m., Clay heard the sound he'd been hoping for: helicopters approaching from multiple directions. The FBI had been tracking the CB transmissions and had deployed tactical response teams to Clay's location. The stalkers realized that their operation had been compromised and that law enforcement was converging on their position. Instead of surrendering, they made a final desperate attempt to eliminate Clay before the authorities could intervene. Gunfire erupted across the boat launch area as the stalkers attacked Clay's truck, while simultaneously trying to escape the approaching law enforcement units. Clay found himself in the middle of a firefight between federal agents and a criminal organization that was willing to kill anyone who threatened their trafficking operation. The battle lasted 15 minutes and resulted in the deaths of 3 stalkers, the capture of 7 others, and the recovery of evidence that would eventually lead to the dismantling of a human trafficking network that had been operating across 6 states. But for Clay Henderson, the victory came at a terrible cost. During the firefight, one of the stalkers had managed to plant an explosive device under Clay's fuel tank. The device detonated as FBI agents were securing the area, destroying Clay's truck and seriously injuring 2 federal agents. Clay survived the explosion, but his injuries ended his career as a commercial driver. More disturbing was the discovery that the trafficking network had backup plans for eliminating witnesses and their families. Despite the arrests at Conscious Lake, other members of the organization remained active and focused on retaliation. 6 months after the confrontation, Clay was living under federal protection while the FBI continued investigating the scope of the trafficking network. The organization had been using kidnapped truck drivers to transport victims and contraband across the country, with a sophisticated command structure that included corrupt law enforcement officers, DMV employees, and trucking company insiders. The fake Dale Morrison had been one of at least 12 stalkers who specialized in identifying and capturing target drivers. The network had been responsible for over 40 disappearances of commercial drivers across the Southwest, with most victims either killed after their usefulness ended or held in captivity at remote facilities where they were forced to participate in trafficking operations. Clay's daughter Emma was relocated to a secure facility while the FBI dismantled the remaining cells of the organization. But Clay knew that the network's reach had been so extensive that complete elimination might be impossible. Late at night, Clay would sometimes monitor CB radio channels, listening to the conversations between drivers who continued to travel the highways where he'd once made his living. Occasionally, he would hear exchanges that reminded him of his own encounter with the stalkers. Helpful drivers reporting mechanical problems, asking about destinations, building rapport with potential victims. Each time, Clay would switch to those channels and broadcast warnings about the trafficking network, describing the tactics used by the stalkers and urging drivers to report suspicious contacts to law enforcement. Some drivers listened to his warnings. Others ignored them, convinced that such dangers were exaggerated or unlikely to affect them personally. Clay Henderson had survived his encounter with the highway predators, but he knew that the threat continued for thousands of truck drivers who traveled America's highways alone, unaware that their routines and isolation made them perfect targets for people who understood the transportation industry well enough to exploit it. The CB radio frequencies that had once carried friendly conversations between professional drivers now carried the potential for contact with predators who used that same communication system to identify and track their prey. For Clay, the static between stations had become the sound of a hunting ground where the next victim was always just one transmission away. Troy Mansfield had been driving the lonely stretches between Denver and Salt Lake City for 12 years, and he'd always prided himself on being the kind of trucker who stopped to help stranded motorists. At 41, the stocky driver with graying temples had pulled over countless times to assist broken-down cars, provide jumper cables, or call for help when people found themselves in trouble on America's remote highways. It was part of the unwritten code among professional drivers. Help when you can, because someday you might need help yourself. That philosophy would nearly cost Troy his life on the night of October 15th, when his burgundy Kenworth T800 was rolling westbound on Interstate 80 through the barren landscape of southwestern Wyoming. Troy was hauling restaurant equipment from Denver to a customer in Reno, running about 2 hours ahead of schedule thanks to light traffic and favorable weather. The October night was clear and cold, with temperatures dropping toward freezing as Troy climbed through the high desert terrain. At 2:17 a.m., as Troy passed the exit for Point of Rocks, his CB radio crackled with what sounded like an emergency transmission. Break 19, this is an emergency. Is there a trucker out there who can help? My car broke down and my wife is having a medical emergency. We need immediate assistance. Troy immediately grabbed his microphone. After 12 years on the road, he'd responded to dozens of genuine emergency calls, helping stranded families, accident victims, and travelers who found themselves in dangerous situations far from help. Go ahead with your emergency. This is an eastbound. Troy caught his mistake. This is a westbound trucker at mile marker 89. What's your situation? Thank God, somebody answered. My name is Frank. My wife and I are broken down on the side of I-80 at mile marker 91. She's diabetic and she's going into shock. I don't have cell coverage and I can't get the car started. Can you please help us? Troy checked his position. Mile marker 91 was about 2 miles ahead of his current location. He could see a few scattered lights in the distance that might indicate a vehicle on the shoulder. I'm about 2 minutes from your location. I'll pull over and see what I can do. Do you need me to call for medical assistance? Yes, please. She needs help fast. We're in a blue sedan on the right shoulder. Hazard lights are on. Troy pressed down slightly on his accelerator, closing the distance to the stranded motorists while reaching for his cell phone to call 911. Wyoming's wide-open spaces often had spotty cell coverage, but emergency calls usually got through even when regular service was weak. As Troy approached mile marker 91, he could indeed see a blue sedan parked on the shoulder with its hazard lights blinking. The vehicle appeared to be a mid-size car, possibly a Honda or Toyota, with what looked like two people inside. Troy began slowing his loaded truck, preparing to pull over behind the disabled vehicle. Troy's cell phone showed no signal bars, which wasn't unusual in this remote area. He would have to use his CB radio to contact emergency services through a relay with other truckers, or drive to the next truck stop to use a landline. Troy activated his hazard lights and brought his Kenworth to a stop about 50 yards behind the blue sedan, positioning his truck to provide protection for the disabled vehicle in case other traffic approached. The technique was standard among professional drivers. Use the truck as a shield while providing assistance to smaller vehicles. As Troy climbed down from his cab, he could see two figures in the sedan. The passenger appeared to be slumped over, which was consistent with a medical emergency. The driver was waving at Troy, apparently relieved that help had arrived. Troy grabbed his emergency kit from behind his seat, which contained basic first aid supplies, jumper cables, and emergency flares. As he walked toward the sedan, the driver got out to meet him. "Thank God you stopped," the man said. He appeared to be in his 50s, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt with the kind of worn appearance that suggested he might be a rancher or outdoor worker. "My wife Sarah collapsed about 20 minutes ago. I think it's her diabetes, but I can't be sure." Troy approached the passenger side of the sedan to assess the woman's condition. She was indeed unconscious, slumped against the passenger door with her head tilted back. Her breathing appeared shallow, and her skin had a pale, clammy appearance that could indicate a diabetic emergency. "Sir, I need to get medical help for your wife immediately," Troy said. "My cell phone isn't getting service here, but I can drive to the next truck stop and call for an ambulance." "Is there anything you can do for her right now?" "I'm afraid she might not make it if we wait for you to drive somewhere and call." Troy had basic first aid training, but diabetic emergencies required specific medical intervention that was beyond his capabilities. However, he also understood the man's desperation and fear for his wife's life. "Let me check her pulse and breathing, then we'll decide the best course of action." Troy opened the passenger door and gently checked the woman's vital signs. Her pulse was weak but steady, and her breathing was shallow but regular. Without blood sugar testing equipment or emergency medications, there wasn't much Troy could do except monitor her condition and get professional medical help as quickly as possible. "We need to get her to a hospital," Troy told the husband. "I can drive you both to the nearest emergency room, or I can go call for an ambulance. Either way, we need to act fast." "Could you drive us? I don't think she can wait for an ambulance to get all the way out here." Troy hesitated. Loading an unconscious person into his truck cab would be difficult and potentially dangerous if her condition worsened during transport. But he also understood that in remote areas, ambulance response times could be an hour or more, which might be too long for a serious diabetic emergency. "All right, let's get her into my truck. But we need to be very careful moving her." As Troy and the husband worked to lift the unconscious woman from the sedan, Troy noticed something that struck him as odd. Despite her apparent medical emergency, the woman was wearing a full face of makeup and her hair was carefully styled. Most people experiencing diabetic shock would show signs of distress, sweating, and dishevelment that would disturb their appearance. Troy dismissed his observation as irrelevant. People reacted differently to medical emergencies, and the woman might have been dressed up for an evening out when the emergency occurred. With considerable effort, Troy and the husband managed to get the woman into the passenger seat of Troy's truck cab. The husband climbed into the sleeper berth area, positioning himself to monitor his wife's condition during the drive. "The nearest hospital is in Rock Springs," Troy said as he started his truck. "That's about 40 miles, so it'll take us roughly 45 minutes with this load." "Whatever you can do. I just can't lose her," Troy pulled his truck back onto Interstate 80 and began the drive toward Rock Springs, pushing his speed as much as safety would allow with a heavy load. As he drove, Troy kept glancing at the woman to monitor her condition. Her breathing remained shallow but steady, and she showed no signs of improvement or deterioration. About 10 minutes into the drive, Troy noticed something else that bothered him. The woman's clothes were clean and fresh-looking, without the wrinkles or dishevelment that would normally result from collapsing in a car and being moved multiple times. Her purse was neatly positioned beside her, and her jewelry appeared to be expensive and carefully arranged. Troy began to wonder if he was seeing the real signs of a diabetic emergency, or if something else was happening that he didn't understand. "Sir, has your wife been diabetic for a long time?" Troy asked the husband. "About 10 years. She usually manages it pretty well, but sometimes she has episodes like this." "Does she carry emergency medication, glucose tablets, or an insulin kit?" There was a brief pause before the husband answered. "She left her kit at home tonight. That's part of the problem." Troy's first aid training told him that experienced diabetics rarely traveled without emergency supplies, especially on long drives through remote areas. The husband's explanation was possible, but it added to Troy's growing sense that something about the situation wasn't quite right. As Troy continued driving toward Rock Springs, he decided to test his suspicions by asking more specific questions about the woman's medical history and emergency care needs. If this was a genuine diabetic emergency, the husband should be able to provide detailed information about his wife's condition and treatment requirements. "What type of insulin does your wife use, and when did she last eat?" Again, there was a pause before the husband answered. "She uses the regular kind, and she had dinner around 6 o'clock. Troy's uneasiness increased. People who lived with diabetic spouses for years typically knew specific medication names, dosages, and detailed management procedures. The husband's vague answers suggested he might not be as familiar with diabetes care as he claimed. Troy glanced in his rearview mirror and noticed that the husband was no longer focused on monitoring his wife's condition. Instead, he appeared to be studying the interior of Troy's truck cab, paying particular attention to the communications equipment and control systems. "Sir, are you all right back there?" "Just worried about Sarah. How much farther to the hospital?" "About 25 miles. Her breathing seems stable, which is a good sign." Troy decided to conduct one more test of the situation. He reached for his CB radio and announced his intention to contact the hospital to notify them of the incoming emergency. "Rock Springs Regional. This is a commercial driver inbound with a diabetic emergency. Estimated arrival in 20 minutes. The response from the husband was immediate and telling. "You don't need to do that. Let's just get there and let them handle it." Troy's military training from his National Guard service began to assert itself. People in genuine medical emergencies typically wanted as much advance preparation and assistance as possible. The husband's reluctance to have the hospital notified in advance was suspicious and potentially dangerous. Troy made a decision that probably saved his life. Instead of continuing toward Rock Springs, he took the next exit and headed toward a well-lit truck stop that he knew had 24-hour services and security cameras. "Where are you going?" the husband asked, his voice carrying a new edge of tension. "There's a truck stop here with an EMT station. They can provide immediate care while we wait for an ambulance." "No, we need to go to the hospital. Keep driving." The husband's tone had shifted from desperate gratitude to something more controlling and demanding. Troy's instincts told him that he was no longer dealing with a grateful family member, but with someone who had a specific agenda that didn't necessarily involve getting medical care for the unconscious woman. Troy pulled into the brightly lit truck stop parking lot and positioned his truck near the main entrance where security cameras and witnesses would be available. As he shut down his engine, he noticed that the unconscious woman was showing signs of increased alertness, as if she was beginning to wake up from whatever had caused her condition. "Sir, we're at the truck stop. Let's get your wife inside where they can help her." But as Troy prepared to climb down from his cab, he heard a sound that changed everything about the situation. The distinctive click of a firearm being cocked, coming from the direction of the sleeper berth where the husband was positioned. "Mr. Mansfield," the husband said, his voice now cold and professional. "You're going to shut off your radio, start your truck, and drive where I tell you to go. And you're going to do it right now." Troy realized that his good intentions had led him into a carefully planned trap, and that the medical emergency had been designed to lure him into a situation where he could be controlled and potentially kidnapped by people who understood how to exploit truckers' willingness to help stranded motorists. The question now was whether Troy's decision to stop at the truck stop had given him enough advantages to escape from what was clearly a well-organized criminal operation. Troy's hands froze on the steering wheel as he processed the reality of his situation. The medical emergency had been an elaborate deception designed to get him to stop his truck and place himself at the mercy of armed criminals who had studied trucker psychology well enough to exploit their most admirable qualities. "Who are you people?" Troy asked, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "People who need your truck and your cooperation," the armed man replied. "The woman beside you is going to wake up in about 30 seconds, and when she does, you're going to follow our instructions exactly. No radio calls, no attempts to signal for help, no heroics." Troy glanced at the woman, who was indeed beginning to stir, as if awakening from sedation rather than recovering from a diabetic coma. Her movements were too controlled and coordinated for someone emerging from a genuine medical emergency. "Start the truck, Mr. Mansfield. We have a delivery to make, and you're going to help us complete it." Troy realized that he was being kidnapped for the purpose of using his truck and possibly his identity to transport something illegal. The criminals had specifically targeted a commercial driver because trucks could carry large loads with minimal scrutiny, and professional drivers had the credentials and knowledge needed to move cargo across state lines. Troy's military training told him that his best opportunity to escape would come during the next few minutes, while they were still in the well-lit truck stop where witnesses and security cameras might provide protection. Once he was forced to drive to an isolated location, his chances of survival would diminish significantly. "I need to do my pre-trip inspection," Troy said, knowing that federal regulations required commercial drivers to inspect their vehicles before driving. "DOT requires it, and if we get stopped by law enforcement, they'll want to see the inspection log." The armed man considered this for a moment. "You've got 2 minutes. The woman will stay in the truck with me. If you try anything stupid, she gets hurt first, then you." Troy understood the threat, but he also recognized that the criminals were allowing him to leave the truck cab, which might provide opportunities they hadn't anticipated. As Troy climbed down from his Kenworth, he noted the positions of security cameras, other vehicles, and potential witnesses in the truck stop parking lot. The facility was busy even at 3 a.m., with several other trucks parked nearby and drivers moving between their rigs and the main building. Troy began his pre-trip inspection, walking around his truck while checking lights, tires, and mechanical systems. The procedure was routine for professional drivers, but Troy was using it to assess his tactical situation and identify potential escape routes. As Troy inspected his trailer, he noticed something disturbing. The rear doors showed signs of recent tampering, with scratches around the lock mechanism that suggested someone had gained access to his cargo area during his stop to help the stranded motorists. Troy opened the trailer doors and discovered that his load of restaurant equipment had been supplemented with additional cargo, unmarked wooden crates that hadn't been there when he'd loaded in Denver. The crates were heavy, secured with professional-grade strapping, and marked only with coded numbers that provided no indication of their contents. Troy realized that the fake medical emergency had been designed not just to kidnap him, but to use his truck as cover for transporting whatever was concealed in those crates. The criminals had access to his cargo manifest, his route information, and his truck while it was stopped on the highway. Troy's inspection of the crates was interrupted by the sound of his truck's air horn, a signal from the criminals that his time was up. As Troy closed the trailer doors and returned to his cab, he understood that he was now part of a criminal operation, whether he cooperated or not. The woman was fully conscious now, sitting upright in the passenger seat with none of the disorientation that would accompany recovery from a genuine medical emergency. She was attractive, probably in her 30s, with the kind of professional appearance that would make her seem credible as a stranded motorist. "Mr. Mansfield," she said as Troy climbed into the driver's seat, "I want you to understand that we've researched you thoroughly. We know about your ex-wife Linda, your son Jason, who's a sophomore at Colorado State, and your mortgage payment that's been late 3 times in the past year." The personal details were designed to demonstrate that the criminals had extensive information about Troy's life and could potentially target his family for retaliation if he didn't cooperate. "We also know that you've been making this Denver to Reno run twice a month for the past 3 years, that you always stop at the same truck stops, and that you have a reputation for helping stranded motorists. That's what made you perfect for our purposes." Troy started his truck and prepared to pull out of the parking lot, but he was also considering his options for resistance or escape. The criminals were confident and well organized, but they were also operating in unfamiliar territory where Troy had advantages they might not expect. "Where am I supposed to drive?" Troy asked. The woman produced a GPS device and set it on the dashboard. "Follow this route exactly. No deviations, no unscheduled stops, no attempts to contact law enforcement." Troy looked at the GPS display and saw that the route led north from the truck stop, away from the interstate and toward remote areas where help would be difficult to find. The destination appeared to be a location in the mountains of southern Montana, nearly 300 miles away. "What's in those crates in my trailer?" "Nothing that concerns you, Mr. Mansfield. Your job is to drive the truck and follow instructions. As long as you do that, you'll live through this experience." As Troy pulled out of the truck stop and followed the GPS route north on Highway 191, he tried to process the full scope of the operation he'd been drawn into. The criminals had conducted detailed surveillance of his routes and habits, gained access to his truck and cargo, and developed a deception sophisticated enough to exploit his willingness to help people in distress. The level of planning and resources suggested a professional criminal organization with connections to transportation industry databases and possibly law enforcement information systems. They knew details about Troy's life that should have been confidential, and they had the capability to modify cargo loads without detection. Over the next hour, as Troy drove through increasingly remote terrain, he listened to the criminals' conversation and tried to piece together their operation. References to delivery schedules, receiving teams, and border protocols suggested they were part of a larger smuggling network that used commercial trucks to move illegal cargo across long distances. The woman occasionally spoke on a cell phone, providing status updates to someone who appeared to be coordinating multiple operations simultaneously. Troy heard references to other trucks, different routes, and delivery locations across the western United States. "Package 1 is on schedule for 0800 delivery," she reported during one call. "Driver is compliant and route is secure." Troy realized that he and his truck were designated as Package 1 in what appeared to be a coordinated smuggling operation involving multiple vehicles and drivers. He was probably not the only trucker who had been deceived into transporting illegal cargo. At 4:30 a.m., as Troy drove through the remote mountain roads of southern Montana, the GPS directed him to turn onto a dirt road that led away from the main highway. The road appeared to be a logging or mining access route, unmarked and barely wide enough for Troy's truck and trailer. "Where are we going?" Troy asked as his truck bounced over the rough terrain. "Delivery point," the armed man replied. "You'll unload the crates, transfer them to another vehicle, and then we'll discuss your future involvement in our operations." Troy understood that future involvement probably meant permanent silence. Once he had delivered the illegal cargo and could identify the criminals and their operation, He would become a liability that needed to be eliminated. Troy's military training told him that his chances of survival were decreasing rapidly as he was taken further from populated areas and potential help. He needed to take action soon, or he might not get another opportunity. The dirt road led to what appeared to be an abandoned mining facility in a remote valley surrounded by dense forest. Troy could see several buildings, vehicles, and people moving around the site, evidence of a well-established operation with permanent infrastructure and significant personnel. As Troy's truck approached the facility, he saw armed guards and heavy equipment that could unload his trailer quickly and efficiently. The criminals had created a logistics center capable of handling multiple truck deliveries and redistributing cargo to smaller vehicles that could blend into normal traffic. Troy also noticed something that gave him both hope and terror. Several other commercial trucks were parked at the facility, including vehicles from different companies and states. Either the criminals were running a larger operation than Troy had imagined, or some of those trucks belonged to drivers who had encountered the same trap Troy had fallen into. The question was whether those other drivers were still alive, or whether their trucks were all that remained of people who had been eliminated after completing their unwilling deliveries. As Troy parked his truck at the designated unloading area, he realized that he was about to discover the true scope of a criminal operation that used the good intentions of professional drivers against them, turning America's highways into hunting grounds where predators posed as victims to lure their prey into isolated areas where screams for help would never be heard. The woman climbed down from Troy's cab and walked toward a group of people who were clearly waiting for his arrival. As she spoke with them, pointing back at Troy's truck, he could see them nodding and preparing to begin the unloading process. Troy understood that once his cargo was removed, his usefulness to the criminals would end, and his survival would depend on whatever mercy they chose to show to someone who had seen too much of their operation. Looking at the other trucks parked around the facility, Troy suspected that mercy was not a quality these criminals possessed in abundant supply. Troy sat in his truck cab, engine still running, watching as armed men approached his trailer with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this many times before. The remote mining facility buzzed with activity even at 5:30 a.m., suggesting a round-the-clock operation that processed multiple deliveries on a continuous schedule. Through his windshield, Troy could see the other trucks parked throughout the facility. A closer look revealed details that made his blood run cold. Several of the rigs showed signs of hasty repainting, with company logos that didn't quite match the original colors underneath. License plates had been changed, some so recently that the mounting bolts were still shiny. These weren't just trucks belonging to other victims. They were trucks that had been stolen from drivers who were no longer in a position to report the theft. The woman who had posed as the diabetic emergency victim appeared at Troy's driver's side door, no longer maintaining any pretense of being helpless or grateful.
Mr.
Mansfield, you're going to step out of the truck now, slowly with your hands visible. Troy climbed down from his cab and immediately noticed the organized nature of the facility. Guard posts, communications equipment, heavy machinery for cargo handling, and what appeared to be a vehicle modification garage where trucks could be repainted and remarked with different company identities. Impressive setup, Troy commented, hoping to gather information about the scope of the operation. 12 years of development, replied a man Troy hadn't seen before, apparently the facility's manager. He was in his 40s, wearing clean work clothes and speaking with the confidence of someone accustomed to complete control over his environment. We've processed over 200 drivers through this location. You're just the latest addition to our collection. Troy felt his stomach tighten at the phrase, processed over 200 drivers. The clinical language suggested that drivers weren't just robbed or released after delivering cargo. They were handled according to systematic procedures that had been refined through extensive experience. What happens to the drivers after they make their deliveries? The manager smiled coldly. That depends on several factors. Cooperation level, potential value, family connections that might generate law enforcement attention. Some drivers become permanent employees. Others serve different purposes. As Troy was led away from his truck, he passed close enough to the other parked rigs to see inside some of the cabs. Personal belongings were still scattered throughout the sleepers: family photos, clothing, CB radios tuned to channels their owners would never monitor again. The trucks had become monuments to people who had disappeared from America's highways without leaving any trace of their fate. Troy was escorted to a building that appeared to be the facility's administrative center. Inside, he found a sophisticated operation that tracked truck movements, driver information, and cargo manifests across multiple states. Wall-mounted screens displayed real-time information about highway traffic, weather conditions, and law enforcement activities. "Sit down, Mr. Mansfield," the manager said, gesturing to a chair in front of a desk covered with file folders. "Let's discuss your future with our organization." Troy noticed that the folders contained detailed dossiers on truck drivers, complete with photographs, route information, family details, and financial records. His own folder was already present, suggesting that he'd been under surveillance for weeks or months before being targeted. "How long have you been watching me?" "Long enough to know that you're exactly what we need. Reliable, predictable, with a reputation for helping stranded motorists. You fit our recruitment profile perfectly." The manager opened Troy's file and began reading details that should have been confidential: employment history, credit reports, family relationships, medical records, information that could only have been gathered through illegal access to multiple databases. Troy Mansfield, age 41, divorced, 1 child, clean driving record, current on truck payments but struggling with other debts. No close family relationships that would trigger immediate investigation if you disappeared. Perfect candidate for our driver training program. Troy realized that the criminals weren't just stealing cargo or trucks. They were specifically targeting drivers who could be forced to work for their organization without generating immediate law enforcement attention. "What kind of training program?" "We train drivers to transport specific types of cargo along specific routes using modified documentation and communication procedures. The work is lucrative, but it requires complete loyalty and absolute discretion." Troy understood that he was being offered a choice between becoming a criminal or becoming a victim. The criminals had developed a systematic approach to recruiting unwilling participants for their smuggling operations. "And if I refuse?" The manager's expression didn't change. "Then you join the drivers who chose not to cooperate. Would you like to meet some of them?" Before Troy could respond, he was led through a door at the back of the building and down a set of concrete steps into what appeared to be a basement or underground facility. The temperature was noticeably cooler, and the air carried the smell of dampness and something else Troy couldn't identify. The basement contained a row of cells constructed from chain-link fencing and concrete blocks. Most appeared to be empty, but Troy could see figures in several of the enclosures, people wearing the clothing and having the appearance of truck drivers. "Gentlemen," the manager called out, "I'd like you to meet Troy Mansfield, our newest candidate. Troy, meet some of your colleagues who chose the non-cooperative path." Troy approached the nearest cell and found himself face to face with a man who appeared to be in his 50s, wearing a faded company uniform and showing signs of prolonged captivity. "How long have you been here?" Troy asked quietly. 8 months, the man replied. "Name's Curtis Webb. I was hauling furniture from Phoenix to Denver when they got me with the same fake emergency call you probably fell for." Troy realized he was looking at one of the missing drivers who had simply vanished from America's highways, leaving families wondering what had happened and law enforcement agencies with no leads to follow. "Curtis Webb from Flagstaff?" Troy asked. "Your disappearance was in the news. Your wife has been searching for you." Curtis's expression showed both hope and despair. "Is Linda still looking? It's been so long, I thought maybe she'd given up." The manager interrupted the conversation. "Mr. Webb chose not to participate in our driver training program. As you can see, That decision has consequences. Troy looked at the other occupied cells and realized he was seeing a collection of missing truck drivers who had been held captive for months or possibly years. The criminals weren't just running a smuggling operation. They were operating a prison where drivers who refused to cooperate were held indefinitely. "What do you want them to do?" Troy asked. "Transport cargo that requires special handling and discretion. Human cargo primarily, though we also move other high-value merchandise that benefits from the mobility and documentation that commercial drivers provide." Troy's blood ran cold as he understood the full scope of the operation. The criminals were using kidnapped truck drivers to transport human trafficking victims across the country, exploiting both the drivers' credentials and their truck's ability to move freely on interstate highways. "Human trafficking," Troy said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Among other services, our clients pay premium rates for transportation that can't be traced to them or their organizations. Kidnapped drivers provide the perfect cover. They have legitimate credentials, clean records, and trucks that can pass inspection at any checkpoint." Troy realized that the drivers in the cells weren't just prisoners. They were slaves being forced to participate in crimes that made them complicit in human trafficking and other serious felonies. Even if they were eventually released, their involvement in illegal transportation would make them vulnerable to prosecution. "How many drivers are you holding here?" "Currently, 12, but we rotate inventory regularly. Some drivers eventually agree to cooperate and are transferred to active duty. Others serve their purpose in different ways." The phrase "serve their purpose in different ways" carried implications that Troy didn't want to contemplate. He was beginning to understand that drivers who continued to refuse cooperation might face elimination to prevent them from providing information to law enforcement. As Troy was led back upstairs to the administrative office, he tried to process the full scope of the criminal enterprise he had stumbled into. The facility was processing multiple truck drivers, stolen vehicles, illegal cargo, and human trafficking victims on a continuous basis. The operation had the resources and organization of a major business, with systematic procedures for recruiting unwilling participants and eliminating potential witnesses. "Mr. Mansfield," the manager said as they returned to his office, "you have a choice to make. You can join our active driver program and earn substantial compensation for transporting specialized cargo, or you can join your colleagues in the basement and hope that your situation eventually improves." Troy understood that cooperation would make him complicit in human trafficking and other serious crimes, while refusal would likely result in prolonged captivity or death. Neither option offered a future he could accept. "I need time to think about this." "Of course. You'll have plenty of time in your new accommodations downstairs. When you're ready to discuss cooperation, just let the guards know." As Troy was escorted back toward the basement cells, he realized that his window of opportunity for escape was closing rapidly. Once he was locked in the underground facility, he would be completely dependent on his captors for survival, with no ability to communicate with the outside world or coordinate rescue attempts. Troy's military training told him that his best chance of survival lay in attempting escape before he was secured in the basement prison. The facility was remote and heavily guarded, but it was also confident in its security procedures and might not expect resistance from a truck driver who had been cooperative thus far. As they descended the concrete steps toward the basement, Troy made his decision. Instead of allowing himself to be locked in a cell with the other captive drivers, he would attempt to fight his way out of the facility and try to bring help for all the victims being held there. The question was whether one trucker with military training could successfully challenge an organized criminal operation that had been capturing and controlling professional drivers for over a decade. Troy's opportunity came sooner than he expected. As the guard opened the door to what would be his cell, Troy noticed that the man had become complacent, probably from months of dealing with demoralized prisoners who offered no resistance. The guard turned his back to Troy while unlocking the chain-link door, apparently confident that a middle-aged truck driver posed no threat. Troy's 6 years of military police training came back to him in an instant. He wrapped his left arm around the guard's throat while simultaneously grabbing the man's sidearm with his right hand. The guard struggled briefly but lost consciousness within seconds from the properly applied chokehold. "Curtis, anybody else who wants out of here, now's your chance," Troy whispered to the captive drivers as he dragged the unconscious guard into the empty cell and locked it. 3 drivers immediately responded. Curtis Webb, along with 2 others who introduced themselves as Roy Dalton from Utah and Shane Mitchell from Colorado. All 3 had been held for months and were desperate for any opportunity to escape. "They've got guards posted throughout the facility," Curtis warned. "Plus, they've got communications equipment that can call for backup from other locations." Troy understood that their window of opportunity would be measured in minutes before the facility's security systems detected the problem and organized a response. Their only chance was to move fast and create enough confusion to reach the vehicles before being recaptured. "Curtis, you and the others head for my truck. Keys are in the ignition. If I'm not there in 5 minutes, leave without me." Troy handed Curtis the guard's weapon and headed back upstairs toward the administrative building. If he could disable the communications equipment and create enough chaos to delay pursuit, the escaped drivers might have a chance to reach civilization and bring help for the others. Troy found the administrative building in a state of casual alertness. Most of the staff were focused on processing his truck's cargo and didn't immediately notice his presence. Troy was able to reach the communications center and destroy several pieces of equipment before guards realized what was happening. The facility's alarm system activated as Troy fought his way back toward the parking area. Armed guards were converging from multiple directions, but the confusion and darkness worked in Troy's favor. He could see his truck's headlights moving toward the facility's exit, carrying the 3 escaped drivers toward potential safety. Troy realized he wasn't going to reach his truck before the guards cut off his escape route. Instead, he ran toward one of the other stolen trucks parked nearby, a freightliner that had apparently belonged to another kidnapped driver. The keys were in the ignition, suggesting the criminals were confident that no one would be able to steal vehicles from their secure facility. As Troy started the truck and began driving toward the exit, he heard gunfire erupting around the facility. The guards were shooting at both his truck and the escaping Kenworth, apparently under orders to prevent any witnesses from reaching the outside world. Troy's truck reached the dirt access road just as several pursuit vehicles began following him. The next 20 minutes became a desperate chase through mountainous terrain, with Troy's heavy truck struggling to maintain speed on winding roads, while armed criminals pursued him in lighter, more maneuverable vehicles. Troy's CB radio crackled with transmissions from his pursuers as they coordinated their attempt to stop him before he could reach populated areas or contact law enforcement. "Target is eastbound on Forest Road 42. All units converge on Highway 191 intersection. Control Center, we have a containment failure. 3 additional targets have escaped in the eastbound Kenworth. Request immediate backup from all available units." Troy realized that Curtis and the others were also being pursued, and that the criminal organization had resources positioned throughout the region to prevent escaped victims from reaching safety. As Troy descended from the mountains toward Highway 191, he could see roadblocks being established by vehicles from the criminal organization. The network was extensive enough to field multiple teams and coordinate activities across a wide area of Montana and Wyoming. Troy's truck approached the highway junction at high speed, with pursuit vehicles close behind and roadblock vehicles positioned ahead. Troy had to choose between attempting to break through the roadblock or trying to evade capture in the mountainous terrain where his heavy truck would be at a severe disadvantage. Troy chose to fight rather than run. He aimed his stolen truck directly at the roadblock, using the Freightliner's size and weight to smash through the blocking vehicles and continue on to the main highway. The collision destroyed several criminal vehicles and injured their occupants, but it also damaged Troy's truck and alerted the organization that at least one escaped victim was willing to use violence to reach safety. As Troy's damaged truck limped eastbound on Highway 191, he used his CB radio to broadcast continuous emergency calls on multiple channels. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Troy Mansfield driving a stolen freightliner eastbound on Highway 191 near the Montana-Wyoming border. I have escaped from a criminal facility where truck drivers are being held captive for human trafficking operations. Multiple drivers are being pursued by armed criminals. Request immediate law enforcement assistance." Troy's broadcast was heard by other truckers, who relayed the message to emergency services and began converging on his location to provide assistance. Within 30 minutes, Troy found himself surrounded by a convoy of commercial trucks whose drivers had responded to his emergency call. The criminals pursuing Troy found themselves facing not just one escaped victim, but a coordinated response from the trucking community that had been alerted to the threat against their colleagues. The pursuing vehicles fell back as more trucks joined the convoy, creating a moving shield that protected Troy until law enforcement could respond. At 8:30 a.m., Montana State Police intercepted the convoy and took Troy into protective custody. His debriefing led to the largest multi-state raid in the history of trafficking investigations, as federal agencies coordinated attacks on facilities in Montana, Wyoming, Utah, and Colorado. The raid on the mining facility rescued 8 remaining captive drivers and recovered evidence of a trafficking network that had been operating for over 15 years. Investigators found records documenting the kidnapping and exploitation of more than 300 truck drivers, along with evidence of human trafficking operations that had moved thousands of victims across the country. But Troy's victory came at a terrible cost. Curtis Webb and one of the other escaped drivers were recaptured and killed by the criminal organization before law enforcement could reach them. Only Shane Mitchell survived to provide testimony about the conditions inside the facility and the systematic abuse of kidnapped drivers. The investigation revealed that the fake emergency calls had been just one method used by the criminal network to capture drivers. They had also used fake DOT inspections, staged accidents, and job offers to lure victims to remote locations where they could be kidnapped and forced to participate in illegal transportation operations. Troy spent 6 months in federal protective custody while the investigation and prosecution proceeded. The trials resulted in dozens of convictions and life sentences for the organization's leadership, but investigators acknowledged that other cells of the network were probably still operating in different regions. Troy never returned to long-haul trucking. The physical and psychological trauma of his captivity and escape, combined with ongoing security threats from surviving members of the criminal network, made it impossible for him to resume his career on the highways where he had been hunted. Instead, Troy became a consultant for federal agencies investigating crimes against transportation workers. His experience provided unique insights into the methods used by criminals who exploited the trucking industry and the psychology of drivers who fell victim to deception. Troy's case became required study for truck drivers and law enforcement agencies throughout the country. The fake emergency call method was so effective that dozens of drivers reported similar encounters after Troy's story became public. Most had escaped because they recognized the warning signs that Troy had identified, but investigators suspected that many drivers had been captured using variations of the same technique. For drivers who still traveled the remote highways of the American West, Troy's experience served as a grim reminder that their instinct to help people in distress could be used against them by predators who understood the psychology and culture of professional truckers. The CB radio frequencies that once carried requests for assistance now carried an undertone of suspicion and fear. Drivers who encountered stranded motorists began verifying emergency situations through multiple sources before stopping to provide help. The culture of mutual aid that had characterized trucking for decades was fundamentally changed by the knowledge that help seekers might be hunters in disguise. Troy still monitored CB radio traffic from his home in Colorado, listening to the conversations between drivers who continued to work the routes where he had been captured. Sometimes he heard calls for assistance that reminded him of his own experience. Motorists with medical emergencies, broken-down vehicles, and desperate pleas for help from Good Samaritans. Each time, Troy would broadcast warnings about the fake emergency tactics used by criminal networks, urging drivers to verify situations before stopping and to maintain communication with other truckers while providing assistance. Some drivers heeded his warnings. Others dismissed them as paranoid or exaggerated. But Troy knew that somewhere on America's highways, other predators were using the same methods that had nearly cost him his life. They were studying drivers' routes and habits, identifying victims who fit their recruitment profiles, and preparing elaborate deceptions designed to exploit the very qualities that made truckers valuable members of society. The fake emergency call technique had proven so effective because it targeted drivers' most admirable instincts, their willingness to help people in distress, their sense of responsibility to protect other travelers, and their commitment to the unwritten code of mutual assistance that bound the trucking community together. Troy Mansfield had survived his encounter with the Good Samaritan trap, but he understood that his escape had come at the cost of other drivers who had fallen victim to the same deception. The mining facility had been shut down and its operators imprisoned, but the methods they had developed were still being used by other criminals who understood that the best way to catch a trucker was to appeal to his conscience. Late at night, when Troy couldn't sleep, he would think about Curtis Webb and the other drivers who had died trying to escape from captivity. Their sacrifice had helped expose a network that had victimized hundreds of people, but Troy knew that similar operations were probably still active in other locations. The highways that had once represented freedom and independence for American truckers had become hunting grounds where predators used fake emergencies to lure their prey into traps from which few escaped. And somewhere in the static between CB radio channels, Troy could still hear the echoes of desperate calls for help that might be genuine cries for assistance, or might be the carefully crafted lies of hunters who understood that the best bait was always compassion.